Constantinople did not fall like a city made of stone. It fell like an old world taking one last breath, beneath smoke, cannon fire, church bells, exhausted soldiers, whispered prayers, and a pale dawn rising over walls that had protected Rome's last heir for more than 1,000 years. Before the final assault, before the Ottoman soldiers climbed through smoke and broken masonry, before the emperor vanished into the last struggle near the walls, before the city's streets filled with fear and shouting, Constantinople still stood. Wounded, hungry, surrounded, and almost alone, but still standing. It had stood for so long that many people could hardly imagine the world without it. The city had watched emperors rise and fall. It had seen armies approach from east and west. It had heard the languages of merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, monks, ambassadors, sailors, slaves, scholars, and refugees. It had guarded the meeting place of continents, where Europe and Asia looked toward one another across water. It had held churches filled with gold light, palaces worn by centuries, harbors crowded with ships, markets filled with spices and cloth, and walls so strong that they seemed less like human work and more like part of the earth itself. Those walls had become a promise. They had promised survival. For centuries, Constantinople had been more than a capital. It had been the city where Rome continued after Rome itself had fallen in the West. People today often call it Byzantine, but the people of the empire did not think of themselves as something separate from Rome. They called themselves Romans. Their emperor was Roman. Their law, ceremony, imperial memory, and sacred authority descended from the old world of Caesar and Constantine. The city on the Bosporus carried that memory long after the western provinces had changed beyond recognition. To outsiders, it was a wonder. To enemies, it was a prize. To its people, it was the center of the world. And by 1453, it was also a shadow of what it had been. That is the first sadness of Constantinople's fall. The city that died in 1453 was not the full giant of earlier centuries. It was not the Constantinople of immense wealth, vast imperial territory, and confident power. It was an old imperial heart inside a body that had been slowly losing strength for generations. The empire around it had shrunk, provinces had been lost, armies had weakened, trade had shifted, rival powers had grown, internal divisions had hurt it. The great city had survived disasters before, but survival had taken pieces from it each time. A city can outlive its empire, but it cannot do so without scars. By the 15th century, Constantinople was still magnificent in memory, but in reality it was partly empty, partly ruined, and deeply vulnerable. The population was far smaller than in its greatest age. Whole areas within the walls were less crowded than they had once been. Gardens, fields, abandoned spaces, and old structures lay within a city built for a much larger people. The imperial palace no longer shone with the same force. The emperor's authority was limited. Foreign merchants held influence. The city still possessed sacred beauty, but sacred beauty does not fill granaries or pay soldiers. And outside the walls, a new power had risen. The Ottoman Turks had expanded across Anatolia and into the Balkans, surrounding Constantinople by land and reducing the city to an island of imperial memory within a sea of Ottoman strength. The city that once commanded roots now found itself trapped between Ottoman territories. Its position remained magnificent, but magnificence had become danger. Constantinople sat where everyone wanted control: the Bosporus, the Golden Horn, the bridge between worlds, the passage between seas, the key to empire. For the Ottomans, taking Constantinople meant more than winning a city. It meant completing a vision. For Sultan Mehmed II, young, ambitious, intelligent, and relentless, Constantinople was not simply a military target. It was the great prize that would make his rule unforgettable. Others had tried to take it and failed. Arab armies had failed. Bulgarian rulers had failed. Rus, raiders had failed. Earlier Ottoman attempts had failed. Crusaders from the west had taken and damaged the city in 1204, but that had been a different wound, a Christian conquest that weakened Byzantium deeply without ending its imperial memory forever. Mehmed wanted the final conquest. He wanted the city that had resisted the world, and he prepared with seriousness. The siege of 1453 was not a sudden accident. It was the result of planning, pressure, engineering, ambition, and a clear understanding that Constantinople could not be left unconquered if Ottoman power was to fully dominate the region. The city stood like a thorn inside Ottoman territory. It could invite Western aid. It could serve as a symbol of rival legitimacy. It could obstruct imperial dreams. To leave it standing was to leave unfinished business at the heart of empire. Mehmed knew this. The defenders knew it too. Inside Constantinople, Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos faced an impossible burden. He was heir to a line of emperors stretching back into an ancient world, but the empire he ruled was small, poor, divided, and outmatched. He did not have the armies of old Rome. He did not command the wealth of earlier Byzantine emperors. He did not have enough men to properly defend the entire length of the walls. He did not have enough reliable help from the West. He had courage, duty, religious devotion, imperial memory, and a city whose walls were still among the strongest in the world. Sometimes history gives a person a role too large for any human being. Constantine XI's role was to be the last emperor of a dying world. He seems to have understood the danger clearly. He sought help from Western Christian powers. Some help came, but not enough. The old division between Eastern Orthodox Christians and Western Latin Christians still mattered. The memory of the Fourth Crusade, when Western Crusaders had sacked Constantinople in 1204, remained bitter. Religious union with Rome was discussed and partly proclaimed as a desperate measure to gain military aid, but many in Constantinople opposed it. To some, union with the Latin Church felt like betrayal. To others, refusing Western help seemed suicidal. The city was not only surrounded by enemies, it was divided by memory. Imagine the weight of that in the months before the siege. The emperor needing Western aid, knowing many of his people mistrusted it. Priests and citizens arguing about faith, identity, and survival. Some preferring Ottoman rule to Latin religious domination, or at least saying so in bitterness. Others seeing no hope without Western arms. Merchants worrying about ships and goods. Soldiers inspecting walls. Families storing what they could. Monks praying. Officials counting men and supplies. Foreign defenders arriving in small numbers, brave but insufficient. The city waited between pride and desperation. And beyond it, Mehmed built the future. One of his most important preparations was control of the Bosporus. He strengthened Ottoman control by building a fortress on the European side of the strait, Rumeli Hisari, opposite an earlier Ottoman fortress on the Asian side. This allowed the Ottomans to threaten and control ships passing through the Bosporus. Constantinople had always depended on water routes. A city surrounded by water can be strong if the water brings supply and allies. But if the water is controlled by the enemy, the sea becomes a tightening hand. Mehmed understood geography as power. He also understood terror as communication. Ships passing without permission could be stopped. The message was clear. Constantinople was being isolated before the siege fully began. The city's lifelines were being watched. Its world was narrowing. Every merchant, sailor, ambassador, and citizen could feel that the Ottoman noose was tightening. But the most famous sign of the coming siege was the cannon. The age of castles and walls had been changing, and Constantinople's fall became one of the great symbols of that change. The city's Theodosian Walls had resisted attack for centuries. They were not ordinary walls. They were a vast defensive system: outer wall, inner wall, towers, moat, layered protection, built and rebuilt over time. They had survived because they were not a single line, but a deep barrier. For medieval armies without overwhelming artillery, they were terrifying. But Mehmed brought cannon, including enormous guns capable of throwing massive stone balls against the walls. These cannon were not modern machines. They were slow, difficult, dangerous, and demanding. They required teams of men, animals, powder, engineering, patience, and repair. They could crack from use. They had to be loaded carefully. their rate of fire was slow. But when they spoke, the sound must have shaken the imagination of everyone who heard them. For the defenders, the cannon were not just weapons. They were signs that the world had changed. A wall that had stood against centuries now had to endure thunder made by human hands. Try to imagine the first days when the Ottoman bombardment began. The defenders knew walls, they trusted walls. Their ancestors had trusted walls. The city's identity was wrapped around those walls. Then the cannons fired, smoke erupted, the earth shook. A stone ball struck the ancient masonry, dust burst outward. Stones cracked, men flinched, birds rose from towers. Somewhere inside the city, people heard the distant thunder and knew that the siege had truly begun. The sound carried through streets, churches, houses, courtyards, markets, and ruins. Children heard it. Old people heard it. Monks heard it during prayer. Women carrying water heard it. Merchants heard it beside closed shops. Soldiers heard it from the wall. The emperor heard it and understood that courage alone would not be enough. Still, the defenders worked. When the cannon damaged the walls by day, men repaired them by night. Earth, timber, rubble, barrels, stones, and whatever could be used were brought to patch breaches. The Theodosian Walls were strong, but strength in siege is not a fixed thing. It must be renewed every day. A cracked wall is not only a military problem. It is a race between destruction and repair. The Ottomans fired. The defenders rebuilt. The Ottomans fired again. The defenders worked again. This rhythm became part of the city's last life. Inside the walls, fear did not mean surrender. The defenders were few, but many were determined. Among the most important was Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, a Genoese commander who arrived with trained men and brought skill in defending fortifications. His presence strengthened morale. Foreign soldiers from Genoa, Venice, and other places joined the defense. Greeks, Italians, and others stood together on the walls, not always free from tension, but united by necessity. Constantinople's last defenders were a mixture of worlds. Orthodox Romans defending their ancient capital. Latin Christians fighting beside them despite centuries of distrust. Foreign merchants protecting their interests and honor. Sailors turned fighters. Nobles, commoners, monks, and townspeople drawn into one final defense. The city that had been divided by memory was forced into unity by danger. But unity came late. Outside, the Ottoman camp was enormous compared with the defenders. Mehmed's army included many kinds of soldiers, engineers, artillerymen, sailors, laborers, and support personnel. The camp around Constantinople was itself a temporary city of war. Tents stretched across the land. Fires burned at night. Horses moved. Commands passed. Drums sounded. Prayers were spoken. Supplies arrived. Cannon were positioned. Trenches were dug. Siege works advanced. Men waited for orders under the eyes of a sultan determined not to fail. The Ottomans were not a chaotic crowd throwing themselves at walls. They were organized, patient, and commanded by a ruler with a clear objective. Mehmed had to manage more than military force. He had to manage morale. Constantinople had defeated many before him. His army knew the city's reputation. The longer the siege continued, the more pressure increased. Failure would damage his authority. Success would make him legendary. Every day mattered. Every bombardment, assault, naval maneuver, negotiation, and engineering effort was part of a larger psychological contest. The city had its walls. Mehmed had time, numbers, artillery, and will. One of the great challenges was the Golden Horn, the harbor protected by a massive chain stretched across its entrance. The chain prevented Ottoman ships from simply entering and attacking the city's vulnerable sea walls from inside the harbor. Constantinople's defenders knew the importance of the Golden Horn. As long as the harbor remained protected, supplies and naval defense had a chance. Mehmed responded with one of the most famous maneuvers of the siege. Ottoman ships were transported overland, dragged across greased logs or prepared routes, into the Golden Horn, bypassing the chain. Whether imagined in exact detail or simplified in later memory, the effect was dramatic. The defenders woke to a changed reality. Ottoman ships were now inside the harbor they thought protected. The psychological shock must have been immense. The city's defenses had been turned by ingenuity and labor. The water inside the protective chain was no longer safe. A city under siege fears every new direction of danger. Now Constantinople had to defend more walls, more shoreline, more uncertainty. The defenders, already too few, were stretched even further. The Ottoman presence in the Golden Horn forced them to divide attention and manpower. It also showed Mehmed's resourcefulness. He was not simply battering walls blindly. He was solving problems. He was tightening pressure from multiple sides. The city's space to breathe became smaller. Inside Constantinople, daily life became siege life. Food mattered, water mattered, sleep mattered, news mattered, rumor mattered. A city under siege becomes a place where every sound is interpreted. A cannon shot, a shout from the wall, a bell, a messenger, a rumor that Western ships are coming, a rumor that no help will come, a rumor that a breach has opened, a rumor that the Sultan will negotiate, a rumor that someone has betrayed a gate. Hope and fear passed through streets faster than official truth. People still had to live. They prayed, ate what they could, cared for children, carried supplies, repaired damage, watched smoke rise from the walls, listened to cannon, and waited. The city's great churches and monasteries became centers of spiritual endurance. Hagia Sophia, once the greatest church of the Christian Empire, stood as the sacred heart of the city. Its dome had seen coronations, processions, imperial ceremonies, theological debates, triumphs, disasters, and generations of prayer. In the final siege, it became more than architecture. It became a place where the city's fear gathered before God. Imagine entering Hagia Sophia during those last weeks. The space is vast, but the empire outside it has become small. Candles tremble. Icons shine dimly. Voices echo beneath the dome. The people pray for deliverance, but perhaps many know that deliverance may not come. The building itself carries the memory of a stronger age. It remembers emperors who commanded armies, patriarchs who shaped doctrine, choirs that filled the air, mosaics that glowed above worshippers. Now the city is starving for help, and the walls are breaking. A sacred building can make decline feel even sharper, because beauty remembers what power has lost. The emperor himself moved through this world as both ruler and symbol. Constantine XI had to encourage defenders, organize resistance, deal with foreign commanders, maintain public spirit, and face the possibility that he would be remembered as the emperor who lost the city. Yet in another sense, he may have known that his task was not to save the empire in the ordinary sense. It was to meet the end with dignity. There is a kind of courage that cannot win. It can only witness. Constantine's courage belongs to that category. He could not create armies from nothing. He could not heal centuries of decline. He could not force Western Europe to send enough aid. He could not erase Ottoman power. He could not silence the cannons. What he could do was remain with the city. Remain at the walls. Remain emperor until there was no empire left to rule. That kind of ending is why the fall of Constantinople still feels haunting. It is not only about strategy. It is about dignity in defeat. Outside, Mehmed also understood symbolism. He wanted the city, but he also wanted legitimacy. Constantinople was not to be merely destroyed. It was to become his capital. He would inherit its geography, its prestige, its imperial aura. Conquering it would not only end one empire, it would transform Ottoman power into something larger. Mehmed could present himself not just as a warrior, but as ruler of the city of emperors. Both sides knew they were fighting over more than walls. They were fighting over memory. The siege continued through April and May. Cannons battered, defenders repaired. Ottoman assaults tested the walls. Naval actions occurred. Negotiations failed. Omens and rumors spread. The defenders grew more exhausted. The Ottomans grew impatient but determined. Every passing day brought the city closer to the moment when repair would no longer keep up with destruction. A siege is not one event. It is a slow narrowing of possibilities. At first, the city hopes for relief. Then it hopes to endure. Then it hopes for a miracle. then it hopes to survive one more night. By late May, the final assault approached. Mehmed prepared his forces. The defenders understood something decisive was coming. In the city, the final days took on a sacred and tragic atmosphere. Enemies within Christianity, Eastern and Western, worshipped together in the face of extinction. Processions moved through the city. Prayers rose. Confessions were made. The emperor addressed his men. The defenders took positions. The people waited. On the last night, Constantinople became a city between worlds. Behind the walls were those who still believed, or wanted to believe, that the city might endure as it had endured before. Beyond the walls were thousands of Ottoman soldiers preparing for the assault that would decide everything. Above them all was the same night sky that had watched the city for centuries. The old city breathed in darkness. The fires of the Ottoman camp burned outside. The churches glowed within. The walls stood between them, damaged but not yet broken. And somewhere in that darkness, the last Roman emperor prepared to face the morning. On the last night, Constantinople became a city between worlds. Behind the walls were those who still believed, or wanted to believe, that the city might endure as it had endured before. Beyond the walls were thousands of Ottoman soldiers preparing for the assault that would decide everything. Above them all was the same night sky that had watched the city for centuries. The old city breathed in darkness. The fires of the Ottoman camp burned outside. The churches glowed within. The walls stood between them, damaged but not yet broken. And somewhere in that darkness, the last Roman emperor prepared to face the morning. But to understand that final night, we must step back into the weeks before it, when the siege had already become part of the city's daily rhythm. Constantinople had not yet fallen, but it had begun to live like a city that knew it was being slowly measured by death. Every day had its pattern: cannon fire, dust, repair, prayer, exhaustion, rumors, hunger, and waiting. The Ottoman cannons did not only strike stone, they struck time. Each blast reminded the defenders that the ancient protection of the city could be wounded. The Theodosian Walls had survived so much that their endurance had become part of Constantinople's soul. They were not merely defensive works. They were the line between memory and extinction. Generations had trusted them. Enemies had broken themselves against them. Their layered strength had made the city feel almost chosen, almost unreachable, almost beyond normal conquest. But in 1453, the walls were being asked to resist a newer world. The bombardment created a terrible daily contest. The Ottomans fired their great guns, and the defenders rushed to repair the damage. Masonry shattered, dust rose, sections weakened, towers trembled. Men dragged timber, barrels, earth, stones, brushwood, rubble, and whatever else could fill gaps. They worked under danger, knowing the next shot could undo hours of labor. A wall during siege is never finished. It is always becoming damaged and becoming repaired, becoming weaker and being forced to stand again. At night, repair work took on a strange urgency. Darkness hid some movement from Ottoman eyes, but it also made labor more frightening. Men worked by torchlight and moonlight. They climbed rubble, carried loads, shouted instructions, coughed through dust, and tried to make broken places defensible before morning. Hands bled, backs ached. Sleep became a luxury stolen in fragments. The defenders were not only fighting the Ottomans. They were fighting fatigue, darkness, fear, and the simple weight of stone. A city can be defended by courage for only so long before bodies begin to fail. Inside the walls, people listened. This is one of the most overlooked parts of siege life. Those who were not standing on the walls still lived inside the sound of war. A mother could be preparing a small meal when the cannon shook the air. A priest could be chanting prayers when the blast rolled through the church. A child could wake at night because voices shouted near the streets. An old man might sit in a doorway and remember earlier times when Constantinople had seemed vast and unbreakable. A merchant might stare at closed goods and wonder if wealth mattered when the city itself was trapped. Siege turns a city into an ear. Every sound becomes information. A cannon blast tells you the enemy is working. A bell tells you someone is calling for prayer, warning, or order. A rumor tells you what people fear. A silence tells you something worse may be coming. In Constantinople, rumor must have been everywhere. Some said Western ships would come. Some said no help was coming. Some said the city would be saved by divine intervention. Some said the sins of the people had brought judgment. Some blamed religious union with Rome. Some blamed those who resisted union. Some blamed the emperor's weakness. Others praised his sacrifice. Some whispered that the Ottoman Sultan would offer terms. Others said there would be no mercy if the walls were stormed. No besieged city lives on facts alone. It lives on fear arranged as stories. And Constantinople had many stories to draw from. It had prophecies, old legends, sacred expectations, memories of past deliverance, memories of disaster, and deep religious imagination. For centuries, the city had seen itself as protected by God and the Mother of God. Icons, processions, relics, prayers, and sacred ceremonies had accompanied moments of danger before. In earlier sieges, faith and defense had blended into one experience. The walls were military, but the city's survival was also understood spiritually. So in 1453, the question was not only whether the walls would hold, it was whether heaven would intervene. This gave the final siege a tragic spiritual intensity. The defenders did not live in a modern secular world where artillery and logistics were the only explanations. They saw meaning in signs. Eclipses, strange lights, weather, accidents, processions, and omens could be interpreted as messages. A city under extreme pressure becomes hungry for signs because ordinary certainty has failed. If human strength is not enough, perhaps divine meaning can still be read. But signs can comfort or terrify. A bad omen in a besieged city spreads faster than fire. When people are exhausted, even small events become heavy. A failed procession, an icon slipping, bad weather, strange light in the sky, a rumor from the walls, these can become proof to frightened minds that the city is abandoned or that a miracle is near. Hope and despair can use the same event. The emperor had to lead people living inside this emotional storm. Constantine XI was not ruling a normal capital. He was ruling a final refuge. The empire beyond the city had been reduced to fragments. His crown carried the weight of ancient Rome, but his resources were painfully small. He had to depend on a limited number of defenders, some of them foreign, some loyal through faith, some through honor, some through interest, and all of them facing an enemy far larger than themselves. Yet leadership is not only numbers. A leader in such a moment becomes a symbol people can stand behind when reason says they should break. Constantine could not promise certain victory. That would have been false, but he could embody refusal. He could show that the city's last emperor would not abandon it. That mattered. In a world shaped by honor, faith, and imperial memory, remaining at the wall was itself a form of speech. He did not need to say, "Rome still lives." His presence said it. Beside him, Giovanni Giustiniani and his men played a central role in the physical defense of the land walls. Giustiniani was experienced, practical, and skilled in siege warfare. His arrival had been one of the city's real hopes. He brought not only men but competence. In a siege, competence is comfort. A confident commander at a weak point can steady terrified defenders. A skilled engineer can turn rubble into resistance. A man who knows fortifications can make a damaged wall fight again. The defense of Constantinople depended heavily on such individuals because there were so few defenders compared with the enormous length of the walls. The land walls were magnificent, but they required men. Stone without men is only stone. Every tower, gate, breach, and vulnerable section needed watchers, fighters, repair crews, and command. The defenders had to choose where strength mattered most because they could not be everywhere equally. The Ottomans knew this. They pressed. The land walls, especially near the weakest and most damaged sections, became the focus of destruction. Repeated bombardment turned parts of the old defenses into rubble, but rubble can also defend if men use it well. The defenders created improvised barriers. They filled gaps. They fought from broken ground. They transformed damage into rough protection. The siege became a contest not only between cannon and wall, but between engineering and improvisation. Mehmed's army was also working constantly. The Ottoman camp was full of movement. Artillery crews serving guns, soldiers digging trenches, engineers preparing assaults, sailors handling ships, commanders planning, religious figures encouraging the men, supply workers moving food and materials, animals pulling loads, fires burning at night. A siege army is not only fighters. It is a whole laboring world aimed at one target. Mehmed had to keep that world focused. He was young but not careless. His ambition was immense, but ambition alone does not take Constantinople. He had to overcome walls, water defenses, morale, time, possible relief from the west, and the symbolic weight of earlier failures. Every day the city held was a challenge to him. Every Ottoman loss mattered. Every delay risked frustration. If the siege dragged too long, supply problems, disease, political pressure, and morale could become threats. The Sultan was besieging the city, but he was also besieged by expectation. He had promised his future to this conquest. The Ottoman camp at night must have been terrifying and beautiful from the walls. Thousands of fires scattered across the darkness, tents in long lines, the glow of torches. The sounds of animals, drums, voices, prayer, command, metal, and movement. From inside Constantinople, the defenders could look outward and see the scale of the force waiting for them. The enemy was not imagined. It burned in the dark. And beyond the camp lay the wider Ottoman world that had made this siege possible. Lands, soldiers, administrators, tax systems, roads, supplies, and political will. Mehmed's army did not appear from nowhere. It was the result of a rising state that had learned how to organize war. Constantinople, by contrast, stood as the remnant of an older imperial order that had once organized the world around itself. The siege was therefore more than a clash of armies. It was old empire against new empire, old walls against new artillery, old memory against new ambition. And in the middle stood human beings who had to eat, sleep, bleed, and decide whether to keep fighting. The sea added another layer. Constantinople had always been a maritime city, shaped by harbors, trade, and water. Its geography was part of its genius. The Bosporus, the Sea of Marmara, and the Golden Horn gave it natural strength and commercial importance. But during the siege, water became both protection and threat. The chain across the Golden Horn had been a defensive advantage, but Mehmed's overland movement of ships changed the emotional map of the city. When Ottoman ships appeared inside the Golden Horn, the defenders must have felt as if the city had been outflanked by imagination itself. A place they thought secure was no longer secure. That is one of the most devastating experiences in war, not simply being attacked, but realizing the enemy has changed the rules. From that point, the defenders had to guard more exposed sections. Their already limited manpower stretched further. The Golden Horn, once a kind of breathing space, became another front. The city's sense of enclosure deepened. The Ottomans were not just outside the land walls. They were pressing against the city's watery life. Still, moments of hope came. A few ships did manage to break through Ottoman pressure and bring supplies, proving that the city was not entirely abandoned. Such moments mattered enormously. A ship arriving in a starving city is more than cargo. It is proof that the outside world still exists. It is a sign that God, allies, chance, or courage may yet intervene. People on the walls and in the harbor would have watched such naval struggles with desperate attention. Hope can arrive on a sail, but hope can also vanish beyond the horizon. The Western aid Constantinople needed did not arrive in decisive strength. Europe was divided, distracted, slow, politically complex, and religiously divided from the Eastern Church. Some individuals came with courage. Some states had interests. Some promises were made, but there was no great rescue powerful enough to break the siege. Constantinople faced its final test with bravery, but not with sufficient support. This loneliness may be the deepest wound in the story. The city that had once stood at the center of Christendom's Eastern Empire now waited almost alone. In Hagia Sophia and other churches, the religious question grew sharper as danger increased. The union with Rome, proclaimed in hope of Western aid, remained controversial. Some Byzantines saw it as necessary, others saw it as spiritual surrender. But as the end approached, the divisions softened in the face of extinction. On the final days, Greeks and Latins worshipped together. The old theological arguments did not disappear, but death stood closer than doctrine. There are moments when history strips people down to what they fear losing most. For Constantinople, that was not only life. It was faith, memory, identity, the sense that the city had meaning in God's plan. The final liturgies carried enormous emotional weight. Candles, chants, icons, incense, prayers, tears, and silence gathered under ancient domes. People confessed sins. They sought forgiveness. They embraced. Soldiers and civilians, Eastern and Western Christians, nobles and commoners, men and women, old and young, all faced the possibility that they were living through the last hours of the city as they knew it. Hagia Sophia had seen imperial glory. Now it saw imperial grief. The emperor's final address to the defenders belongs to the legendary heart of the story, whether preserved with exact wording or shaped by later memory. The meaning is clear. He called upon them to defend faith, city, families, and honor. He understood the stakes. He offered himself as one among them. The final emperor was not leaving. The defenders were not fighting for expansion, tribute, or conquest. They were fighting because the city behind them was all that remained. This kind of defense has a different emotional quality from an empire at its height. A great empire fights with confidence. A dying empire fights with memory. Memory can be powerful, but it is not enough to stop cannon. By late May, the Ottomans prepared for the final assault. Mehmed organized his forces carefully. The attack would come in waves. Irregular troops, Anatolian forces, elite janissaries, and other units would pressure the defenders relentlessly. The idea was to exhaust, overwhelm, and exploit breaches. The defenders, already few and tired, would be forced to hold against repeated assaults across damaged ground. The final night must have been filled with unbearable awareness. Inside the city, people knew. The emperor knew. The defenders knew. The priests knew. The mothers holding children knew. The wounded knew. The foreign soldiers knew. The Ottoman soldiers outside knew too. Even if no one could know exactly how morning would unfold, everyone understood that the siege had reached its edge. There are nights in history that seem longer than ordinary nights. The last night of Constantinople was one of them. Imagine walking through the city in those hours. The streets are dim. Some houses are shuttered. Some people are awake because sleep is impossible. Churches glow with candles. The distant sounds of the Ottoman camp drift through the darkness. At the walls, men prepare weapons, check positions, whisper to one another, stare into the night. Some pray quietly. Some think of families. Some think of home far away in Genoa, Venice, or other lands. Some think of nothing because fear has narrowed the mind to the next breath. The emperor moves among the defenders, perhaps speaking, perhaps simply being seen. His presence is a last form of order. The city's old nobility, foreign commanders, common soldiers, monks, citizens, all live for a moment inside one fragile unity. Old arguments have not vanished forever, but they are no longer the center. The center is the wall, the breach, the gate, the coming dawn. Outside, Mehmed's army prepares with discipline and expectation. Weapons are ready. Units are arranged. Religious encouragement may be given. Drums and cries may rise. The men know the rewards promised for victory. They know the danger. Many will die before the walls, but the prize before them is unlike any other. The city of Constantine, the city of emperors, the city that had resisted Islam for centuries, the city that would make their sultan a conqueror for the ages. For the Ottoman soldiers, this was not only an attack, it was destiny as they understood it. Two worlds faced one another in darkness, each with its own prayers, hopes, and fears. This is what makes the fall of Constantinople so powerful. It cannot be reduced to one side's triumph or the other side's tragedy. It was both. For the Ottomans, it was the opening of a new imperial age, the capture of a legendary city, and the fulfillment of enormous ambition. For the Byzantines, it was the end of an empire that had preserved Roman identity, Orthodox Christian civilization, Greek learning, imperial ceremony, and sacred memory for more than a millennium. The same dawn would be victory for one world and apocalypse for another. Night held them both. At the walls, the defenders waited in the damaged places where the cannon had done their work. Broken masonry, earthworks, wooden reinforcements, debris, and improvised barriers formed the last shield of Rome's heir. The Theodosian Walls still stood in parts, magnificent even wounded, but their aura of invincibility had been broken. The defenders were now holding not an unbroken wall, but a wounded body. A city under siege becomes a body. Walls are ribs, gates are mouths, streets are veins, churches are heartbeats. Citizens are breath, and when the wall breaks, the wound is mortal. Before dawn on May 29, 1453, the final assault began. The night erupted. Drums, cries, cannon, arrows, bells, shouting, and the roar of men moving toward the walls filled the darkness. Ottoman forces advanced. The defenders responded from their positions. Arrows and missiles flew. Men climbed, pushed, fell, shouted, and died. Smoke and dust thickened the air. Torches flickered. The broken walls became a place of chaos where individual courage disappeared into collective struggle. The first waves pressed hard. The defenders held, but holding against one wave is not the same as surviving a planned assault. Mehmed's strategy depended on exhaustion. Each attack forced the defenders to spend strength they could not replace. The city's defenders were brave, but there were too few of them. They fought from broken walls in darkness under pressure, knowing that behind them lay everything they had sworn to protect. The Ottomans had depth. The defenders had desperation. In battle, both are powerful. But depth can survive losses that desperation cannot. As the assault continued, the pressure mounted. Men were wounded. Positions weakened. Commands became harder to hear. Dust and smoke confused vision. The defending line depended on leaders remaining present and morale holding under impossible strain. Then one of the decisive moments came. Giovanni Giustiniani was wounded. Accounts differ in detail, but his injury and withdrawal had a devastating effect on morale at a critical point. In a siege, the fall or removal of one key leader can be more damaging than the loss of many stones. Giustiniani had been a pillar of the defense. His men trusted him. Others trusted his skill. When he was wounded and carried or withdrew from the front, the defenders near that area felt the shock. Was the defense collapsing? Was hope leaving? Was the strongest commander gone? In the confusion of a final assault, perception can become reality quickly. Constantine urged him to remain, according to tradition, but the wound was severe and the moment was breaking. The line weakened. The Ottomans pressed harder. Somewhere, amid darkness and smoke, the final balance shifted. There were also accounts of Ottoman soldiers finding access through a small gate or postern, often associated with the Kirkaporta tradition, though historians debate the details. Whether this specific detail unfolded exactly as later told or not, the larger reality is clear. Ottoman troops gained footholds inside or over the defenses as the defenders were overwhelmed. Once attackers entered in force, the psychological power of the walls collapsed. A wall is powerful while it separates. Once crossed, it becomes only stone behind you. Ottoman banners appeared on the walls. The cry spread. The city was being entered. For those still fighting, this must have been the moment when the world turned unreal. The walls that had protected Constantinople for centuries had been breached. The enemy was not outside anymore. The final Roman city was open. The defenders could still fight, and some did, but the battle's meaning had changed. It was no longer about preventing entry. It was about dying, fleeing, surrendering, hiding, or surviving inside a city whose fate had already shifted. Constantine XI's final moments are wrapped in legend, but that is fitting for the last Roman emperor. He is said to have cast aside imperial insignia and entered the fighting, dying among his men near the walls. His body was never identified with certainty. History does not give him a clean ending. Instead, it gives him something more haunting: disappearance into the last battle. The emperor vanished with the empire. No throne room farewell, no peaceful deathbed, no grand surrender, only smoke, steel, broken walls, and the collapse of the world he had inherited. For centuries afterward, legends grew around him. Some imagined he would return. Some treated him almost as a sleeping emperor, hidden by history, waiting for restoration. Such legends are born when a loss is too large to accept as ordinary. The final emperor could not simply be dead. He had to become memory, symbol, wound, and hope. But in the city that morning, legend had not yet formed. There was only fear. Ottoman soldiers poured into Constantinople. The defenders scattered or were cut down. Civilians fled through streets. Some ran toward churches. Some hid in homes. Some sought protection. Some were trapped. The city that had waited in prayer now filled with the sounds of conquest. Shouting, running, breaking doors, crying, confusion, and violence. The ancient capital had crossed the line between siege and capture. The fall of a city is never only military. It is intimate. It enters houses. It enters churches. It enters kitchens, courtyards, bedrooms, storerooms, alleys, and hiding places. It turns public defeat into private terror. For the people of Constantinople, the morning of May 29 was the end of everything familiar. The Ottoman army had the customary right to plunder after a city taken by storm, though Mehmed later moved to establish control and preserve the city for his own imperial purposes. But during the first hours, terror spread. People were seized, goods taken, sacred spaces violated, families separated. Those who had prayed through the night now faced the physical reality of conquest. Hagia Sophia became the emotional center of that moment. Many people fled there, hoping for divine protection, sanctuary, or miracle. The great church that had held the city's final prayers now filled with desperate humanity. Imagine the vast interior crowded with frightened people. Nobles, commoners, women, children, monks, priests, the old, the wounded, all under the great dome where emperors had once worshipped in triumph. They waited for salvation. Instead, the conquerors entered. The transformation of Hagia Sophia after the conquest became one of the most symbolic acts in world history. Mehmed entered the city and later ordered the great church converted into a mosque. This was not simply practical. It was imperial symbolism. The Sacred Heart of Byzantine Christianity became part of the Ottoman Islamic order. The building did not disappear. It changed meaning. Its stones remained, but its voice was altered. This is how conquest often works. It does not always destroy the monument. It claims it. Mehmed understood that Constantinople's value lay not only in its walls, but in its aura. To burn the city completely would have been to damage the prize. He wanted it as his capital, as the seat of Ottoman imperial glory, as a bridge between worlds, as proof that he had surpassed those who failed before him. He became known as Mehmed the Conqueror, and the city became the center of a new empire. For the Ottomans, 1453 was beginning. For Byzantium, it was ending. And for world history, it became one of those dates that seems to gather more meaning than one day should be able to hold. But the true fall of Constantinople was not only the moment soldiers entered. It was the long decline before, the siege itself, the final night, the broken wall, the death of the emperor, the fear of civilians, the transformation of sacred space, and the birth of a new imperial capital. It was a chain of endings and beginnings tied together by one dawn. The sun rose over a city that was no longer Byzantine, but the stones were the same. The water was the same. The dome of Hagia Sophia still stood. The walls still ran across the land. The streets still wound through hills. The Golden Horn still held its light. The Bosporus still moved between continents. Geography remained while history changed its name. That is one of the strangest things about fallen cities. The place continues. People still need bread. Fires still need lighting, doors still need repairing, bodies must be buried, prisoners counted, buildings claimed, streets cleared, orders given, markets reopened. Survivors decide whether to stay, flee, convert, serve, rebuild, mourn, or begin again. To later generations, the fall seems like a single dramatic event. To those who lived through it, the next morning still had to be survived. The old empire had ended, but hunger had not, grief had not, work had not, memory had not. Memory had not, and that is where the story becomes quieter but not smaller. After the shouting faded, after the first terror of conquest passed, after the gates had opened to a new ruler, and the old banners had disappeared, Constantinople entered the strange afterlife of fallen cities. It had died as the capital of one empire, but it had not died as a city. Its streets still curved over the same hills. Its harbors still touched the same waters. Its walls, though wounded, still enclosed a place of immense value. Its churches, palaces, markets, cisterns, houses, monasteries, ruins, and roads still stood beneath the same sky. A conquered city is not empty the day after it falls. It is full of broken continuity. People wake inside a world that looks familiar and no longer belongs to them in the same way. The door is the same door. The street is the same street. The church dome is still visible. The sea still glitters beyond the slope. The morning air still smells of smoke, dust, salt, animals, fear, and human bodies. But authority has changed. A command in another language may now decide the future. A soldier at the corner may now represent the new order. A building that yesterday meant refuge may today mean possession. A name that had carried centuries of meaning may become unstable in a single dawn. Constantinople had become Ottoman. But this transformation, even when announced by conquest, could not happen all at once. Cities are made of people, and people do not change as quickly as flags. The city had to be secured, counted, claimed, cleaned, restored, repopulated, reorganized, and given a new imperial role. Mehmed had won the prize, but now he had to keep it. That required more than victory. It required rebuilding. The young sultan had not taken Constantinople only to leave it a ruin. He wanted it to live again as the capital of his empire. This is one of the most important things to understand about 1453. Mehmed's conquest was destructive, but it was also possessive. He did not want merely to erase the city. He wanted to inherit its power. Constantinople's geography was too valuable, its prestige too immense, its symbolic weight too great to waste. The city that had carried Roman memory could now be made to carry Ottoman ambition. Conquest often works this way. It breaks a world so that another world can wear its crown. Mehmed entered a city wounded by siege, depopulated compared to its ancient greatness, scarred by centuries of decline and recent violence. But he saw what it could become. He understood that the Bosporus was not a decoration. It was strategy. The Golden Horn was not merely water. It was a harbor. The walls were not just old defenses. They were a statement to future enemies. Hagia Sophia was not only a church. It was a monument whose possession declared a new order. The old imperial city gave the Ottoman Sultan a stage equal to his ambition. He began to reshape the city. The conversion of Hagia Sophia into a mosque was the most powerful symbol. The building had been the sacred heart of Byzantine Christianity, the great church of emperors, the golden space where liturgy and imperial ceremony had met for nearly 1,000 years. To convert it was to say that the old center had been claimed. Yet conversion also preserved the structure. The dome remained. The walls remained. The vast interior remained. The building's meaning changed, but its presence continued. This is one of the haunting truths of Constantinople. The old world did not vanish completely. It was layered under the new one. The city became a palimpsest: Roman, Greek, Christian, Byzantine, Ottoman, Islamic, imperial, commercial, sacred, wounded, rebuilt. Every new age wrote across the old surface, but traces remained beneath. A street might remember Roman planning. A wall might remember Theodosius. A church might become a mosque. A palace ruin might become a quarry. A cistern might continue holding water in darkness. A harbor might receive new ships under a new flag. A marketplace might change language but not the human need for bread, cloth, metal, spice, and work. Maimed City would not be Byzantine anymore, but it could not stop being Constantinople overnight. Even the name carried weight. The Ottomans used forms that would eventually become Istanbul, but Constantinople's older identity lingered in many languages and memories. Names can survive political death. They travel through maps, letters, prayers, trade, grief, and nostalgia. A city's name is not just sound. It is a container of memory. For the surviving Christian population, the aftermath must have been filled with uncertainty. Some had been killed during the capture, some enslaved or taken away, some ransomed, some remained, some returned later. Maimed needed population, craftsmen, merchants, administrators, religious communities, and economic life. A great capital cannot be built from empty streets. He encouraged resettlement and brought people from different parts of his empire. Muslims, Christians, Jews, Greeks, Armenians, Turks, Slavs, and others would shape the city's new life over time. The conquered city became a city of many peoples again, but the balance had changed. The emperor was gone. The Orthodox Church remained, but under Ottoman rule. Maimed allowed the appointment of a new patriarch, giving the Orthodox Christian community an organized place within the Ottoman system. This was politically intelligent. It helped manage the Christian population, gave structure to religious authority, and showed that Ottoman rule could incorporate conquered peoples rather than simply destroy them. But incorporation is not equality. The old imperial church now existed under a Muslim sultan in a Muslim-ruled empire. Its survival came with submission to a new political world. For many Christians, this must have felt like living after the end of history. The empire they had known, or imagined through memory, was gone. The emperor, God's anointed ruler in their political theology, was dead. The great church had been transformed. The city's sacred geography had been altered, yet prayers continued. Children were born, priests served, families adapted, merchants traded. People learned the habits of survival under a new order. History often continues after the moment that feels like the end. That continuation can be painful. The world does not stop to honor grief. A widow still needs food. A child still needs shelter. A craftsman still needs work. A merchant still worries about goods. A priest still lights candles. A ruler still counts population and taxes. A city survives by becoming ordinary again, even when the memory of catastrophe remains extraordinary. For the Ottomans, the conquest gave Maimed enormous prestige. He was no longer only a sultan who had inherited and expanded power. He was the conqueror of the city that had resisted for centuries. He could present himself as heir to Roman imperial space, ruler of a capital placed between continents, master of a city that had once stood at the heart of Christian empire. This changed Ottoman identity. The empire became more than a regional power. It became a world empire with a world capital. Constantinople became the center from which Ottoman power would look in many directions, toward the Balkans, toward Anatolia, toward the Black Sea, toward the Mediterranean, toward the Islamic world, toward Europe, toward imperial memory itself. The city's geography made it impossible to think small. Whoever ruled Constantinople ruled from a place that demanded wide ambition. Seas met there. Roads converged there. Trade, diplomacy, religion, and war all touched its waters. The city had been built by Constantine the Great because its position mattered. Maimed understood the same truth more than 1,000 years later. The conqueror did not only take a city, he took a crossroads. Yet outside Ottoman celebration, the fall of Constantinople sent shock across Christian Europe. The city had long been weakened and politically isolated, but its fall still mattered deeply. It was the end of the Byzantine Empire, the final death of the Eastern Roman state. To Western observers, the loss was a warning, a humiliation, a tragedy, and a call to respond, though responses varied widely and often failed to become meaningful united action. Some mourned the fall as a Christian disaster. Some blamed the Byzantines for religious division. Some blamed Western disunity. Some feared Ottoman expansion. Some treated it as a sign of divine judgment. Some wrote about it with grief. Some used it politically. But no one could ignore it. A city that had stood for over a millennium had changed hands. There are few events that can make time itself feel divided into before and after. For many later historians, 1453 became one of those dates. It is sometimes used as a marker for the end of the Middle Ages, though history never changes so neatly in one year. The Renaissance was already underway in parts of Italy. Gunpowder had been developing before Constantinople fell. Trade networks had long been changing. The Ottoman Empire had been rising for generations. The Byzantine Empire had been declining for centuries. Still, 1453 has symbolic force because it gathers many changes into one image. Ancient Rome's eastern era ended. Gunpowder challenged old walls. Ottoman imperial power took a world city. Christian Europe lost its eastern bastion. Greek scholars and texts, some already moving west before the conquest, became part of broader currents of learning. Mediterranean politics shifted. The old map of imagination changed. Sometimes a date becomes powerful not because everything changes at once, but because people can see change clearly there. 1453 is one of those dates, but the human cost of such dates can be hidden beneath their symbolism. When we say Constantinople fell, the phrase is clean. Too clean. It does not show the men at the walls with dust in their mouths. It does not show the wounded commander carried from the fighting. It does not show the emperor disappearing into battle. It does not show frightened families in Hagia Sophia. It does not show the old woman who had lived through decline and now watched conquest enter her street. It does not show the child taken from home. It does not show the priest unable to protect those who fled to the altar. It does not show the Ottoman soldier who survived the assault and saw the city he had been promised. It does not show the Sultan standing inside the prize he had imagined for years. History compresses suffering into sentences. Our task is to open those sentences again. The city after conquest was full of absence, people missing. Houses empty, churches changed, streets damaged, defenders dead, families broken, the emperor gone, the old court gone, offices dissolved, the old ceremonies ended. Silence in places where imperial life had once moved, but absence is never total. There were still footsteps, new soldiers in old streets, new officials in old buildings, survivors returning cautiously to homes, craftsmen summoned, merchants calculating whether trade could resume, religious leaders negotiating survival, workers repairing gates, walls, harbors, houses, animals moving through debris, ships arriving under a new authority. Mehmed wanted to restore the city's population and economy. He ordered people resettled there from across his domains. Over time, neighborhoods took shape around communities, trades, and religious institutions. Mosques, markets, baths, schools, and palaces would reshape the urban landscape. The Ottoman capital grew into a magnificent imperial city, one of the great centers of the early modern world. The city did not fade after 1453. It expanded into another golden age under another civilization. That is why the fall of Constantinople must be told with balance. For Byzantium, it was catastrophe. For the Ottomans, it was triumph and beginning. For the city itself, it was transformation. A city can die as one thing and live as another. This does not soften the pain of those who lost it. It simply tells the full truth. The same walls that witnessed Byzantine grief later witnessed Ottoman glory. The same waters that carried refugees later carried imperial fleets. The same skyline that lost crosses gained minarets. The same streets heard new languages, new prayers, new commands, new songs, new trades, new children. The place endured by changing. And in that endurance lies both beauty and sorrow. Hagia Sophia stands at the center of this layered memory. For Byzantines, it had been the great church, a vision of heaven on earth. For Ottomans, it became Hagia Sophia Mosque, a symbol of conquest and imperial Islam. For later centuries, it became an object of fascination, scholarship, politics, devotion, controversy, and memory. Its dome has carried more than architecture. It has carried competing claims of sacred history. When Mehmed entered Hagia Sophia after the conquest, later accounts describe him as moved by the ruin and grandeur of the city, perhaps reflecting on the fall of worldly power. Whether every detail is exact or shaped by memory, the image is powerful. A conqueror standing inside the greatest monument of the conquered, aware that even emperors become dust. Conquerors need such moments because victory itself whispers of mortality. If Constantinople could fall, anything could fall. If the Roman emperor could vanish, any ruler could vanish. If Hagia Sophia could change hands, any sacred building could change meaning. Mehmed had won the city, but he had also inherited its warning. Power is never permanent. It only feels permanent while the walls still stand. This is what makes the story Sleep History powerful. It is grand, but also deeply quiet. Beneath the canon and conquest, there is a meditation on time. Constantinople survived so long that survival became part of its identity. Then, one day, survival ended. Not because the city had no beauty, not because its walls had no strength, not because its people had no courage, but because history had shifted around it until courage and walls could no longer overcome the forces outside. Many civilizations fall this way, not all at once. First, the territory shrinks. Then the treasury weakens. Then allies become unreliable. Then old wounds go unhealed. Then enemies grow stronger. Then technology changes. Then the last defenders are asked to do what generations before them failed to prevent. The final moment looks sudden, but it is carrying centuries. Constantinople's fall was like that. The cannon blast of 1453 echoed with the Fourth Crusade of 1204, with lost provinces, with civil wars, with economic dependence, with religious division, with Ottoman expansion, with Western hesitation, with political isolation, and with the simple fact that no city can remain the center of the world forever if the world around it has moved on. The defenders on the wall fought the Ottoman army in front of them, but they were also fighting the weight of their own history. That is why their struggle feels tragic rather than merely military. They were brave, but bravery is not always enough. The emperor was dignified, but dignity does not create reinforcements. The walls were strong, but strength can be outpaced. The churches were full, but prayer does not always mean rescue. The city was ancient, but age is not protection. The final fall reminds us that history is not fair in the way stories often want it to be. The old and beautiful are not always spared. The brave do not always win. The sacred does not always remain untouched. The city loved by its people may still be taken by those who want it more, prepare better, and arrive at the right moment of weakness. That is hard truth, but it is also why remembrance matters. If a city cannot be saved in time, it can still be understood. And understanding is a form of respect. So when we imagine Constantinople after the conquest, we should not freeze it only in flames or grief. We should see the next days too. The cleaning, the counting, the rebuilding, the orders, the returns, the resettlement. The first calls to prayer from a transformed sacred landscape. The quiet Orthodox services continuing elsewhere under new rule. The merchant reopening a shop, the survivor searching for family, the Ottoman official marking property, the craftsman repairing a door, the soldier sleeping after victory, the Sultan planning a capital. History does not end where emotion wants it to end. It keeps moving, and because it keeps moving, memory must work harder. The Byzantine refugees and scholars who left before or after the fall carried pieces of the old world with them. Language, texts, learning, artistic traditions, theological memory, political nostalgia. Greek manuscripts and scholars contributed to currents of learning in Italy and elsewhere, though the relationship between Byzantium and the Renaissance is complex and began before 1453. Still, the fall gave urgency and symbolic weight to the movement of Greek learning westward. The city's death as a Byzantine capital became part of Europe's intellectual memory. Constantinople fell, but Byzantine culture did not vanish. It lived in churches, monasteries, manuscripts, liturgies, art, law, memory, and the Orthodox world. It lived in Russia's developing idea of itself as heir to orthodoxy. It lived among Greek communities under Ottoman rule. It lived in scholars who copied and taught ancient texts. It lived in mosaics, icons, chronicles, and prayers. It lived in longing. Empires can end, while civilizations continue in altered form. The Roman name itself did not vanish cleanly either. The Ottomans inherited lands and populations that still used Roman identity in certain contexts. The Orthodox Christian subjects of the empire could still be associated with the Rum millet, the Roman community in Ottoman terminology. The word Rome had a long afterlife, stretching in unexpected ways through Islam, Christianity, empire, law, and memory. This is one of history's great ironies. The city of the Romans fell to the Ottomans, but Rome's shadow entered Ottoman language and imperial imagination. Mehmed could present himself, in some sense, as Caesar of the Romans, ruler of the old imperial city. Whether accepted universally or not, the claim reveals the magnetic power of Constantinople. To possess it was to inherit a vocabulary of world rule. The city made conquerors think in imperial terms. Constantinople did that to everyone. It was too large in memory to be merely local. For the people living under Ottoman rule after 1453, however, imperial claims mattered less than daily life. How much tax? Which church remained open? Where could one trade? Who had been taken? Who could be ransomed? What language must be used with officials? Could families remain? Would property be restored or reassigned? Would children grow up in fear or adaptation? What did survival require now? The answers varied by person, status, community, and time. Some suffered greatly. Some adapted. Some prospered later under Ottoman rule. Some entered new administrative or commercial roles. Some remained marginal. Some converted. Some preserved old identities. Some lived between worlds. This complexity is important because conquest is not one emotion forever. The first day may be terror. The first year may be grief and adjustment. The next generation may know the city differently. Children born after 1453 did not remember Byzantine rule firsthand. They inherited stories, not experience. Their Constantinople was Ottoman from birth, even if their families remembered another world. Memory changes when witnesses die. The fall of Constantinople eventually became more legend than living wound for many, though for communities tied to Byzantine identity it remained deeply meaningful. The last emperor became heroic memory. The city became lost glory. Hagia Sophia became longing. The walls became symbols of both endurance and failure. The date 1453 became a hinge between worlds, but the Ottoman city grew. It became Istanbul in common usage over time, though names evolved across languages and centuries. It became a center of mosques, palaces, schools, markets, baths, libraries, fountains, and neighborhoods. Under later sultans, especially Suleiman the Magnificent and the great architect Sinan, the city's skyline gained new forms of grandeur. The Ottoman capital did not simply occupy Byzantine remains. It created its own urban civilization. The skyline became a conversation between ages. Domes and minarets rose where imperial churches and walls already stood. The city looked both old and new. That is the deep continuity of Constantinople, Istanbul. It absorbs empires and keeps reflecting them through stone, water, and memory. Still, for this episode, our heart remains with 1453 because that is the night and dawn when one world lost its final political form. The Roman Empire, in its Eastern Christian continuation, ended not with a quiet abdication, but in battle. It ended at walls. It ended with a ruler who did not flee. It ended with sacred spaces transformed, civilians terrified, and a young conqueror stepping into history. The fall of Constantinople is therefore not only a military event, it is the ending of a sentence that began with Constantine the Great. When Constantine founded his new capital in the 4th century, he could not have known the city would outlast the Western Roman Empire by nearly 1,000 years. He could not have known it would become the center of Orthodox Christianity, Byzantine art, imperial ceremony, theological conflict, diplomacy, trade, and siege legend. He could not have known that the city bearing his name would stand until a sultan with cannon finally broke its walls in 1453. But history loves such long echoes. Constantine founded. Constantine XI died. Between them lay more than a millennium of Roman continuity. That is why the last emperor's name feels almost too symbolic. Constantine at the beginning, Constantine at the end, a city named for one, defended by another. The symmetry is so powerful that even if history had been written as fiction, someone might call it too perfect. But history often creates symbols no novelist would dare invent. The last night of Constantinople was not only the end of Byzantine rule. It was the closing of an ancient loop. And yet, beyond the loop, life continued. The city's future belonged to the Ottomans. The empire that took it would last for centuries. The walls would remain. The dome would remain. The waters would remain. The memory would remain. And perhaps that is why the story still moves us. Constantinople fell, but it did not disappear. Its fall was not the erasure of place, but the transformation of meaning. It became a city where victory and grief lived in the same stones, where one civilization's ending became another civilization's capital, where the sacred architecture of one faith became the imperial monument of another, where Roman memory and Ottoman ambition met under the same sky. As evening settles over our journey, imagine the city some days after the conquest. The smoke has thinned, the fires are lower, the worst shouting has passed, the dead have been moved or buried, the streets are still damaged, some doors hang open, some houses are silent, some churches are changed. Some people return carefully to familiar streets now governed by unfamiliar power. At the harbor, water continues to move. Ships still need anchoring. Bread still needs baking. Stone still holds heat from the day. A child looks toward the walls without knowing the centuries they carried. An Ottoman soldier stands near a gate that Roman defenders once held. A priest whispers prayers for the dead. A muezzin's voice begins to mark a new sacred soundscape. The city listens. It has heard Latin, Greek, Turkish, Arabic, Armenian, Slavic, Italian, Hebrew, and many other tongues before, and it will hear more. It has seen emperors, crusaders, merchants, monks, sailors, refugees, generals, slaves, queens, scholars, and sultans. It has been wounded before. It has been proud before. It has been betrayed before. It has been rebuilt before. Now it begins again, not as it was. Never as it was, but still alive. The last Roman emperor is gone. The Byzantine court is gone. The old empire is gone. But the city remains, carrying defeat and victory together, like two shadows cast by the same setting sun. The city remains, carrying defeat and victory together, like two shadows cast by the same setting sun. But to understand why that shadow was so long, we have to look beyond the broken walls and ask what Constantinople meant to the world before it fell. Because the fall of this city did not matter only to the people trapped inside it. It mattered because Constantinople had spent more than 1,000 years standing at the crossing of civilizations, and when it changed hands, every road of memory seemed to shift with it. The city had always been more than its stones. It was geography made imperial. It stood where the Black Sea could reach the Mediterranean. It watched the Bosporus, that narrow waterway where continents almost touch. To the north lay routes toward the Black Sea world, the steppes, grain lands, fur routes, and distant peoples. To the south lay the Sea of Marmara, the Dardanelles, the Aegean, and the Mediterranean. To the east lay Anatolia, Persia beyond, and the deep roads toward Asia. To the west lay the Balkans, Europe, Rome's old lands, and later the Latin Christian world. Constantinople was not placed randomly. It was placed like a hand on the throat of movement. Ships, Armies, merchants, pilgrims, ambassadors, and ideas passed near it or through it. Whoever controlled the city controlled not every route, but enough of them to think in imperial terms. The city's position gave it defensive strength, commercial importance, symbolic power, and an almost theatrical beauty. Water wrapped it, walls closed it, hills lifted it, harbors fed it, churches crowned it, palaces displayed it, markets filled it. The world arrived at its gates and docks carrying silk, grain, wax, slaves, spices, metal, icons, texts, wine, cloth, rumors, and news. For centuries, Constantinople had been a place where distant things became present. A merchant from the Black Sea might walk near a Venetian trader. A monk from a monastery might pass a soldier from the frontier. A diplomat might wait in a hall decorated with imperial images. A pilgrim might enter a church and feel the air thick with incense and empire. A sailor might look up from the harbor and see domes and walls rising above him like proof that human beings could build a city close to heaven. That was part of Constantinople's power. It made authority visible in layers. The walls showed military strength. The palace showed imperial command. The churches showed sacred destiny. The markets showed wealth. The harbor showed connection. The ceremonies showed continuity. The city did not simply tell people it was important. It made them feel it. Imperial ceremony in Constantinople was one of the great languages of power. The Byzantine court understood that rule was not only administration or military force, it was performance. Processions, robes, crowns, chants, icons, gold, incense, throne rooms, carefully arranged audiences, mechanical wonders, formal greetings, and sacred rituals all helped create the impression that the emperor stood at the center of a divinely ordered world. Foreign visitors could be overwhelmed by the choreography of majesty. A ruler who can astonish the imagination has already won part of the political battle. In earlier centuries, ambassadors entering the imperial presence might see wealth, order, and ritual designed to make them understand that Constantinople was not merely another capital. It was the new Rome, the Christian Empire, the city of Constantine, the place where earthly rule and heavenly symbolism met. The emperor was not just a king among kings. In Byzantine ideology, he was the Roman emperor, guardian of Christian order, heir to the ancient imperial line. Of course, reality was often messier. Empires fight civil wars, courts breed intrigue, treasuries run low, armies lose, officials cheat, theology divides, families betray. But ceremony exists precisely because reality is messy. It gives power a cleaner face than life itself. Constantinople mastered that art. Even when the empire weakened, the memory of imperial magnificence remained. The city knew how to look eternal. This made its decline even more painful. Because old glory does not disappear when power weakens. It remains like a bright garment on a thinning body. The emperor may have fewer soldiers, but the title still echoes. The palace may be poorer, but the ceremonies still remember grandeur. The city may have empty spaces within its walls, but its churches still hold centuries of prayer. The walls may be damaged, but their reputation still reaches beyond the horizon. Decline is not the absence of greatness. It is greatness becoming memory before it becomes history. By 1453, Constantinople carried too much memory for its weakened body. The empire around it had been reduced to a small remnant, but the city's symbolic weight had not shrunk. That made the final siege almost unbearably dramatic. Mehmed was not attacking an ordinary city. He was attacking an idea that had outlived its material strength. Constantine XI was not defending an ordinary capital. He was defending a memory too vast for his resources. This imbalance shaped the tragedy. The city looked bigger in meaning than it was in power. The Ottoman Empire, by contrast, was young in comparison but full of force. It had energy, territory, military organization, ambition, and leadership. Mehmed represented movement. Constantinople represented endurance. The siege became the meeting of these two historical moods, movement pressing against endurance until endurance broke. But Ottoman victory was not only a matter of violence. It also represented a new imperial imagination. The Ottomans were not outsiders to civilization arriving at a civilized city. They had their own sophisticated political, military, religious, administrative, and cultural world. Their conquest did not end urban life. It redirected it. Mehmed wanted Constantinople because he understood the language of empire. He knew that capitals matter, symbols matter, sacred buildings matter, strategic waterways matter. The past matters if you can claim it. The conqueror wanted to become heir as much as destroyer. That is why Constantinople's fall should not be told as a simple darkness descending. For Byzantines, yes, it was catastrophe. For the Orthodox Christian world, it was a wound. For many in Europe, it was a shock. But for the Ottomans, it was a creative act of empire building. They would make the city live again on different terms. They would bring new populations, build new institutions, sponsor new architecture, and turn the old Roman capital into the heart of one of the most powerful empires in the world. This dual meaning is what makes the story so rich. End and beginning, grief and triumph, loss and renewal, silence and new sound, a church bell fading, a call to prayer rising, the same city holding both. The people who experienced the conquest did not have the luxury of balanced historical distance. A Byzantine survivor would not comfort himself by saying, "This is also the beginning of Ottoman greatness." His world had been shattered. His emperor was gone. His church's greatest monument had been transformed. His family might be broken. His property might be lost. His status might be changed forever. Likewise, an Ottoman soldier or supporter might not feel the sadness of Byzantine loss. He might see divine favor, military glory, the fulfillment of prophecy, reward for hardship, and the elevation of his sultan. He might see the conquest as justice, destiny, and triumph. History contains both experiences, even when they cannot comfort each other. The same event can be sacred victory to one people and sacred disaster to another. This does not mean all interpretations are equal in pain or power. It means the past was lived by more than one heart. When we return to the city after 1453, we should hear the overlapping sounds: Greek lament, Ottoman command, Latin shock, Orthodox prayer, Islamic thanksgiving, merchant calculation, survivor silence, soldier boasting, clerical negotiation, imperial planning, child confusion. These sounds filled the city's afterlife. Mehmed's task after conquest was immense. He had to restore order after the permitted plunder, protect what he wanted preserved, organize administration, handle populations, assign properties, convert key buildings, repair defenses, rebuild economic life, and make the city worthy of its new role. A conqueror who takes a dead city wins a corpse. Mehmed wanted a capital. So people were brought in. Population policy became part of imperial reconstruction. Communities from different regions were settled in the city. Craftsmen, merchants, religious groups, officials, and ordinary families helped repopulate neighborhoods. Over time, the city regained vitality. Markets revived. Religious institutions multiplied. Ottoman architecture began to shape the skyline. Palaces and mosques rose. The old city became the new seat of rule. But beneath the new life, Byzantine bones remained. The Theodosian Walls still marked the landward edge. Cisterns still held water beneath streets. Old churches remained, some converted, some used by Christian communities, some ruined. Roman roads, forums, columns, aqueducts, and fragments survived in altered form. The city was like an ancient manuscript written over but not fully erased. A person walking through Ottoman Constantinople generations later might see the empire of Mehmed, but also the ghost of Constantine. This is why the city fascinates historians so deeply. It is not a clean replacement. It is accumulation. Rome becomes Byzantium, becomes Ottoman Constantinople, becomes modern Istanbul, each layer arguing with and borrowing from the one before. The fall of 1453 is the hinge, but the door opens into a room already full of older voices. For the wider Orthodox world, the fall reshaped imagination. The Byzantine emperor had been a powerful symbol of Christian political order, even when his actual power was weak. Without him, Orthodox communities had to live under different political arrangements. Moscow and other centers later developed ideas of succession, sometimes imagining themselves as heirs to Christian imperial responsibility. The old Byzantine world did not continue as a state, but its religious, artistic, and cultural memory spread and deepened elsewhere. Icons did not stop being painted. Liturgies did not stop being sung. Greek learning did not vanish. Monasteries did not stop preserving texts. The empire died, but traditions traveled. This is another important lesson. Political collapse is not cultural extinction. States can fall faster than civilizations. A throne can disappear while a language, faith, art, law, memory, and ritual continue. Byzantium after 1453 became a civilization without its old imperial body. It survived in diaspora, church, manuscript, song, architecture, and longing. For Western Europe, the fall became part of a larger awareness of Ottoman power. Some called for crusade. Some feared further expansion. Some mourned the loss. But Western Europe was not united enough to reverse the conquest. Political rivalries, local interests, religious divisions, and practical limitations prevented the kind of decisive response that might have mattered earlier. By the time grief became speech, the city had already changed. This, too, is a recurring pattern in history. Help often arrives as words after the walls have fallen. Western Europe also absorbed Byzantine scholars and texts, though this process had begun before 1453 and should not be simplified into one dramatic transfer. Greek learning had been entering Italy through many channels. Yet the fall intensified the symbolic sense that ancient knowledge had fled westward from a dying Eastern empire. Humanist scholars valued Greek manuscripts, language, philosophy, theology, and literature. Byzantine immigrants contributed to intellectual life in Italy and beyond. So Constantinople's fall became tied, in later imagination, to the Renaissance. Not because the Renaissance began in one morning of conquest. It did not. But because the fall provided a dramatic story for the movement of learning, memory, and texts across regions. The city that lost an empire helped feed another age's search for antiquity. There is a sad beauty in that. Byzantium had preserved so much from the ancient world. Greek texts, Roman law, Christian theology, classical learning, administrative traditions, artistic forms. It had copied, debated, translated, taught, and guarded memory through centuries when many things elsewhere were lost or transformed. Then, in its final vulnerability, its scholars and books became part of the West's own renewal. A dying city can still give gifts, but we should be careful not to make Constantinople valuable only because of what it gave the West. It was not merely a bridge between ancient Greece and Renaissance Italy. It was a civilization in its own right. Byzantine life had its own art, music, politics, theology, diplomacy, humor, cruelty, beauty, bureaucracy, and daily rhythms. Its people did not exist simply to preserve texts for others. They lived in their own present, with their own sense of destiny. The fall matters because their world mattered, not because it was useful to someone else. The city's daily life before the end had been deeply human. Bakers, sailors, monks, nuns, soldiers, widows, children, merchants, scribes, fishermen, porters, icon painters, servants, priests, aristocrats, refugees, beggars, and officials all lived within or around the old imperial city. They argued, prayed, bought food, repaired roofs, told stories, feared taxes, sought marriages, mourned deaths, celebrated feasts, and worried about tomorrow. Their lives were not only preparation for 1453. They were lives. The fall gives them a tragic frame, but we should not reduce them to victims in advance. They woke each morning before knowing how history would remember them. Even in the weeks of siege, people likely found moments of ordinary tenderness. Someone shared food. Someone comforted a child. Someone joked from exhaustion. Someone kissed a husband going to the walls. Someone helped carry stones for repair. Someone prayed beside a stranger. Someone watched the sea and hoped for ships. Someone looked at Hagia Sophia and tried to memorize it as it was. Human beings do this in crisis. They make small islands of meaning while the world collapses around them. The Ottoman soldiers, too, were human, though seen by defenders as the face of destruction. Many were far from home. Some were elite troops trained for war. Others were irregulars hoping for reward. Some were deeply religious. Some were ambitious. Some were frightened. Some died before ever entering the city. Some survived and carried stories for the rest of their lives. For them, the siege was danger, discipline, hunger, fatigue, hope of plunder, loyalty to the Sultan, and participation in a moment they believed history would remember. They were not symbols only. They were men under command, looking at walls that had defeated generations. When the city fell, they too entered a world they had heard about in legend. Imagine an Ottoman soldier standing inside Constantinople for the first time after the assault. He may be exhausted, wounded, stunned by the size of the churches, the walls, the streets, the remains of imperial grandeur. He may feel triumph. He may feel greed. He may feel awe. He may feel nothing yet because survival has emptied him. Later, he will understand where he stood. History often becomes meaningful after the body has stopped trembling. Mehmed understood meaning immediately. His conquest was not only military success, it was identity. He was now the ruler of Constantinople. He could claim to have surpassed previous sultans, fulfilled an ambition stretching across generations, and taken a place that had shaped world history for more than a millennium. He was still young, which made the achievement even more extraordinary. The title conqueror did not decorate him. It defined him. But conquest also burdened him. The city demanded restoration. The empire demanded administration. Victory created responsibility. To rule Constantinople was to accept comparison with emperors. The city had seen greatness before. It would not be impressed by a ruler who merely took it and let it rot. Mehmed had to prove that Ottoman power could match the city's scale. In this way, Constantinople conquered its conqueror too. It forced him to become larger. Great capitals do that. They enlarge rulers or expose them. The Ottoman rebuilding of the city gradually created a new imperial landscape. The Sultan's palace, mosques, markets, schools, baths, charitable complexes, and administrative structures gave the city an Ottoman rhythm. Later sultans would continue this transformation. The skyline became a visual argument. Islam and empire now stood where Byzantine Christianity and Roman power had once stood. Yet because many structures remained, the argument was never written on a blank page. It was written across memory. This layering can be seen in the city's sacred architecture. Churches converted into mosques were not simply reused buildings, they were claims. But they were also preserved through use. Had they been abandoned, many might have decayed faster. Conversion could erase one function while protecting physical form. This does not remove the pain of loss for the conquered, but it shows the complicated life of monuments after conquest. Buildings survive by serving new meanings. Sometimes that survival is beautiful. Sometimes it is painful. Often it is both. The Theodosian Walls, though no longer invincible in the age of cannon, remained one of the great monuments of late ancient and medieval military architecture. Their long line across the landward side of the city continued to define the urban body. Even after the siege, even after repairs and changes, even after military technology moved on, they stood as reminders of the city's extraordinary endurance. Every stone seemed to say, "We held for centuries before we failed." Failure after 1,000 years is not weakness. It is the exhaustion of a miracle. The walls had done what walls could do. They had protected the city through countless dangers. They had bought centuries of survival. They had shaped diplomacy, warfare, and imagination. They could not hold forever because nothing human holds forever. But their final breach does not erase their long success. The tragedy of Constantinople is not that its walls were weak. It is that even the strongest walls eventually meet a world they cannot stop. This is why the cannon matters symbolically. They represent not simply Ottoman power, but historical transition. Gunpowder did not end the Middle Ages by itself, but it changed the relationship between stone and force. Castles, walls, and fortifications had to adapt. The old vertical confidence of masonry faced new pressure. Constantinople's fall became one of the most famous examples of artillery helping bring down an ancient defensive system. The sound of the cannon was the sound of history changing its tools. But tools only matter when used by organized power. Mehmed's artillery mattered because he had the will, resources, engineers, logistics, and command structure to use it effectively. Technology alone does not conquer cities. Men do, states do, systems do, ambition does. The cannon were part of a larger Ottoman capacity. Constantinople fell because the Ottomans could coordinate pressure in multiple forms: land siege, naval maneuvers, bombardment, assaults, morale, logistics, and political determination. The Byzantines, meanwhile, had courage but not enough capacity. This distinction matters. History is cruel to societies that must rely on heroism because institutions have weakened. Heroism can save a moment. It cannot always save a system. Constantine XI and the defenders acted with remarkable courage, but their bravery was standing atop centuries of loss. The empire's earlier wounds had narrowed their choices until the final battle became almost unavoidable. The city's fall was not proof that its defenders lacked courage. It was proof that courage had been left alone too long. That is a lesson beyond Constantinople. When institutions decay, when allies fail, when resources shrink, when old divisions remain unresolved, when enemies learn and adapt, the final defenders often carry blame or glory for problems they did not create. They become the faces of collapse because they are present at the end. But the end began long before them. Constantine XI inherited a dying empire. Mehmed inherited a rising one. At the walls, inheritance met ambition, and ambition won. Yet the memory of Constantine XI endured precisely because he did not abandon the inheritance. The last emperor became noble in defeat. His disappearance allowed legend to wrap around him. Had he escaped and lived in exile, perhaps memory would treat him differently. Had he surrendered early, perhaps he would be judged harshly. By dying or vanishing in the final defense, he became inseparable from the city's fall. The emperor became the final stone in the wall of memory. For the Ottoman side, Mehmed became inseparable from the city's rebirth. He did not merely win a battle. He changed the imperial map. His conquest gave Ottoman history one of its central triumphs. Later Ottoman identity would look back to 1453 as a foundational moment, a sign of divine favor, military greatness, and historical destiny. The city gave Mehmed immortality, just as its fall gave Constantine tragic immortality. One city made two legends. That is rare. And beneath both legends lay the ordinary dead, the soldiers whose names we do not know, the civilians whose fear was never recorded, the people taken, sold, ransomed, hidden, killed, or displaced, the Ottoman men who died in the assaults before victory, the defenders who fell before the emperor, the workers who repaired walls night after night, the sailors who fought in the harbor, the monks who prayed, the women who waited, the children who grew up remembering one morning as the day the world changed. Their lives are the ground beneath the famous names. Without them, history becomes too clean. As our journey moves deeper into the aftermath, the city becomes quieter in imagination. The first violence has passed. The new administration has begun. The conqueror has claimed the Sacred Heart. The old empire has no emperor. The Orthodox community negotiates survival. New populations enter. Markets slowly revive. The harbor returns to work. The walls, damaged but still massive, stand under changing flags. And over time, people adjust to what their parents could not accept. This is one of the most painful facts of history. The unbearable becomes normal for the next generation. Children born after conquest do not remember the moment of loss. They inherit stories, prayers, grievances, pride, and warnings. But they also learn the new streets, New authorities, new opportunities, new dangers, new languages, new taxes, new neighbors, new rhythms. Life is stronger than political memory in daily practice, though memory remains underneath. The city's old name continued to echo, but its daily life became Ottoman. The past became layer, not present, but layers can reappear. Every time someone looked at Hagia Sophia and remembered it as church, the Byzantine layer returned. Every time an Ottoman worshipper entered it as mosque, the Ottoman layer deepened. Every time a scholar copied an old Greek text, the ancient layer lived. Every time a traveler wrote of the city's marvels, another layer formed. Every time a later historian called 1453 an ending, the final Byzantine layer hardened into myth. Constantinople became a city where memory never stopped competing. Perhaps all great cities are like that, but Constantinople more than most. Its position between continents made it a meeting place not only of trade and armies, but of meanings. Christian and Muslim, Roman and Ottoman, Greek and Turkish, Europe and Asia, ancient and medieval, imperial and sacred, ruin and rebirth. The city refused to be only one thing. That refusal is part of its greatness. When we say the fall of Constantinople, we are naming only one movement in a larger symphony. The city fell, yes, but it also transformed. It mourned and then worked. It lost an emperor and gained a sultan. It lost one sacred order and entered another. It lost old ceremonies and developed new ones. It lost population and gained population. It lost an empire and became the capital of an empire. The word fall is true, but incomplete. Still, for the sleep history soul of this story, we return to that final emotional center, the last night and the dawn after it. Because within that short passage of time, we can feel the whole weight of centuries. The old walls, the tired emperor, the young sultan, the prayers, the cannon, the breach, the vanishing of Rome's last heir, the transformation of Hagia Sophia, the city continuing under another sky. That is why this story belongs beside the great endings of history, not because everything stopped. Because something ancient stopped being itself. As night falls again over our retelling, imagine standing across the water from the city days after the conquest. Smoke still rises in places. The walls are scarred. Ottoman standards now mark victory. The dome of Hagia Sophia catches the fading light. Ships move slowly in the harbor. The camp outside begins to change from siege machine to imperial presence. The city is quieter than it was during the assault, but not peaceful. Too much has happened for peace. The Bosporus continues to flow. It has no loyalty to empires. It carried Roman ships, Byzantine ships, Ottoman ships, Venetian ships, Genoese ships, merchant ships, warships, refugee boats. It watched men build walls and break them. It watched prayers rise from different faiths. It watched languages change along its shores. It watched capitals shift names and rulers. Water remembers differently from stone. Stone holds shape. Water carries change. Constantinople was built between them. That is why it endured so long, and why its fall traveled so far in memory. The city stood between stone and water, permanence and movement, old empire and new empire, Christian Rome and Ottoman Islam, Europe and Asia, ending and beginning. And in 1453, all those tensions gathered at dawn. The city did not vanish, but the world that had made it Byzantine did. And across the centuries, that loss still sounds like a bell fading under smoke. And across the centuries, that loss still sounds like a bell fading under smoke. But if we listen carefully, beneath that fading bell, there is another sound. It is quieter than cannon, quieter than the shouts at the wall, quieter than the cries in the streets when the gates were breached. It is the sound of memory moving outward from the ruined empire, carried by people who survived, by books that escaped, by priests who continued praying, by merchants who reopened their shops, by scholars who crossed seas, by communities who learned to live under new rule, and by conquerors who understood that a city this old could not simply be owned like ordinary land. Constantinople had fallen, but its memory began to travel. That is one of the strange afterlives of great cities. While they stand, they gather the world inward. Roads, ships, taxes, armies, ideas, and prayers move toward them. But when they fall, something reverses. Their people scatter, their stories spread, their books move, their grief travels, their legends grow larger than their walls. The city that once pulled the world toward itself begins to send pieces of itself everywhere. After 1453, Byzantium no longer existed as an empire, but Byzantine memory did not remain trapped inside the conquered city. It passed into exile, into churches, into monasteries, into manuscripts, into family stories, into Western humanist circles, into Ottoman administration, into Orthodox identity, into Russian imagination, into Greek longing, into the dreams of people who would never see the city as it had been. A fallen empire can become more powerful in memory than it was in its final political years. That is what happened to Byzantium. In its last decades, the empire had been weak, poor, and surrounded. But after its fall, it became something more haunting. The last Rome, the lost Christian empire, the city of golden domes, the civilization of icons and emperors, the bridge between antiquity and the medieval world, the guardian of Greek learning, the eastern half of Rome that had refused to die until canon and empire finally overwhelmed it. This memory is not always precise. It is often romantic, simplified, or shaped by grief. But it exists because Byzantium occupied a unique place in history. It was ancient and medieval at the same time. Roman and Greek, Christian and imperial, European and Asian, defensive and cosmopolitan, courtly and theological, brilliant and bureaucratic, beautiful and brutal. It could be rigid, suspicious, and politically ruthless, yet also extraordinarily resilient, artistic, intellectual, and spiritually intense. The fall of Constantinople did not create Byzantine greatness. It revealed how long that greatness had lasted. For the survivors, however, memory was not an academic idea. It was personal. A man who had fought on the walls and lived would remember the sound of the final assault in his body. A woman who had hidden in a church or home would remember the morning when the city changed hands. A child who survived might grow old under Ottoman rule, telling younger people about a world they could not imagine except through words. A monk might copy a text and feel that he was preserving more than ink. A scholar might leave for Italy carrying not only books, but the ache of a lost civilization. This is how civilizations survive defeat, not as armies, but as habits of memory. The Byzantine scholars who went west before and after the fall were not all fleeing in one dramatic wave, and the story should not be made too simple. Greek learning had been moving into Italy for generations through diplomacy, trade, church councils, teaching, and manuscript exchange. Western interest in ancient Greek texts had been growing before 1453, but the fall gave the movement a powerful emotional frame. It made the loss of the Eastern Empire feel connected to the preservation of ancient wisdom. A scholar arriving in Italy with Greek books could become, in later imagination, a bearer of a dying city's light. Books are fragile things, but they can outlive armies. A manuscript that fits beneath a cloak may carry more future than a tower. Greek texts of philosophy, history, literature, science, theology, and language entered networks of study. Teachers of Greek helped Western scholars read ancient authors more directly. The Renaissance did not begin because Constantinople fell, but the fall became part of the story people told about the rebirth of learning. In that story, Byzantium was both tragic and generous, conquered in the East, yet contributing to intellectual renewal in the West. This is one of history's bittersweet exchanges. A city loses its throne. Its books find new readers. But Byzantium's afterlife was not only Western. In the Orthodox world, the fall created a deep wound and a question. If the Roman emperor was gone, where did Christian imperial protection now live? If Constantinople, the new Rome, had fallen, what did that mean for the order of the world? Some would eventually look to Moscow and imagine it as a new center of Orthodox destiny, a third Rome. though ideas like this developed in specific historical contexts and should not be flattened into a simple replacement. Still, the longing for continuity was real. People need history to continue after catastrophe. They search for heirs, for signs, for new centers, for explanations that make loss bearable. The Orthodox Church continued under Ottoman rule, and this survival mattered greatly. Mehmed's recognition of the Patriarchate gave the Orthodox community a structured place within the empire. This was practical governance, not sentimental restoration, but it allowed religious life to continue. Liturgies were sung, icons were venerated, priests served, families baptized children, fasts and feasts shaped time. The Church preserved identity in a world where imperial political power was gone. When the empire could no longer protect the Church preserved the memory of the empire. That memory was not only triumphal. It contained grief, warnings, theological interpretations, nostalgia, and endurance. The fall could be seen as divine punishment by some, as tragedy by others, as martyr-like witness by others. People asked why God had allowed it. Had sins led to collapse? Had disunity weakened the city? Had betrayal played a role? Had the West failed the East? Had the people trusted walls too much? Had the end been foretold? Catastrophe creates questions that no answer can fully satisfy. And because no answer satisfies, stories multiply. The last emperor becomes legend. The city becomes sleeping promise. The lost Hagia Sophia becomes a symbol of longing. The walls become a boundary not only in space, but in memory, before the fall and after the fall. People begin to speak of the city with a tenderness sharpened by loss. What had once been daily reality becomes sacred absence. This is how nostalgia forms, not from simple love of the past, but from the pain of knowing it cannot return. The Ottomans, meanwhile, built forward. They did not live inside Byzantine nostalgia. They had their own imperial project. Mehmed founded institutions, repopulated neighborhoods, developed the city as capital, and began reshaping Constantinople into an Ottoman center of power. Later sultans would expand this transformation magnificently. The city became a seat of Islamic learning, imperial administration, artistic production, military power, trade, and architecture. The Ottoman capital would astonish visitors just as Byzantine Constantinople once had. The city's genius survived because each empire made it speak in its own language. Ottoman Istanbul was not merely Byzantine Constantinople with new rulers. It became a new civilization's capital. Mosques rose, markets revived, palaces were built, charitable complexes served communities. Baths, schools, kitchens, fountains, and neighborhoods gave urban life new structure. The city's skyline changed, and yet the old contours remained. Hills, water, walls, harbors, domes, roads, and memory. The old and new did not blend peacefully in a sentimental way. They layered, competed, adapted, and sometimes wounded one another. This is more honest than imagining a smooth transition. Conquest is violent. Transformation is unequal. Sacred loss is real. Political triumph is real. Cultural creation after conquest is also real. The city became Ottoman through power, policy, settlement, religion, architecture, and time. The people who mourned Byzantium did not control that process, but the Ottoman city that emerged was not a hollow occupation. It became one of the great capitals of the world. History can ask us to hold two truths at once. The fall was a tragedy. The city's rebirth was real. If we refuse either truth, we make the past smaller. For ordinary people, the long aftermath was not lived as a grand historical debate. It was lived through taxes, neighborhoods, work, worship, family, trade, and adaptation. A Greek Christian craftsman might live under new authority but continue his trade. A Jewish family resettled in the city might find new opportunity. A Muslim official might arrive to serve the Sultan's government. An Armenian merchant might build networks in the growing capital. A soldier might become part of the new order. A widow might search for missing relatives. A child born years after the conquest might know the city's older story only through elders. The city's population became plural, layered, and alive. This plural life had tensions, inequalities, privileges, restrictions, and possibilities. Ottoman rule organized communities through religious and legal structures that were not modern equality, but allowed diversity to exist within imperial hierarchy. People lived as neighbors and strangers, subjects and communities, traders and rivals, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing, sometimes separated by law, custom, language, faith, and memory. Constantinople had always been cosmopolitan. Ottoman Istanbul remained so, but in a new imperial grammar. The harbor continued to matter. Ships still came. Goods still moved. The Golden Horn still sheltered trade. The Bosporus still carried traffic between seas. Grain, timber, fish, cloth, spices, metal, slaves, ceramics, manuscripts, weapons, and news all moved through the city's economic life. The same geography that had made Constantine's city powerful made Mehmed's city powerful too. Geography does not die with empire. It waits for the next ruler to understand it. The walls, however, gradually changed their meaning. The Theodosian Walls remained impressive, but the military world had shifted. Cannon had shown that even the greatest masonry defenses could be broken. Fortification would evolve. The city's walls still mattered, but their symbolic power began to exceed their practical invincibility. They became reminders of endurance rather than guarantees of survival. A wall that once said nothing can enter now said, once we held. That is a different kind of power. The scars of the siege became part of the city's memory. Repairs could cover damage, but history remains even when stone is rebuilt. A repaired wall may look whole, yet the story of its breaking survives. People point to places. They say, here the cannon struck. Here the breach widened. Here the defender stood. Here the emperor fell, or vanished, or was last seen. Here the city changed. Places become sacred through attention. Even uncertain details gain emotional truth because people need locations for memory. The exact site of the last emperor's death may remain debated or legendary, but the desire to locate it tells us something important. People want history to happen somewhere they can stand. They want grief to have coordinates. The same is true of the Kirkaporta tradition, the story of a small gate or postern left open or breached through which Ottoman soldiers entered. Historians debate its accuracy and significance, but the story persists because it offers a human-sized image of catastrophe. A city protected by enormous walls undone by a small opening. A vast empire ending through one neglected gate. Whether literal or symbolic, it captures a fear older than Constantinople. The smallest weakness can betray the strongest defense. Such stories endure because they compress complexity into image. Cannon represent technological change. The last emperor represents noble defeat. Hagia Sophia represents sacred transformation. The ships dragged overland represent Ottoman ingenuity. The walls represent endurance. The small gate represents vulnerability. Each image carries part of the truth, but no single image contains the whole. The whole truth is larger. Centuries of decline, Ottoman rise, geography, religion, diplomacy, artillery, manpower, leadership, hunger, repair, morale, exhaustion, courage, fear, and chance all converged. The fall of Constantinople was not inevitable in a simple mechanical sense. Different decisions, stronger aid, different timing, or unexpected events might have changed the siege. But by 1453, the city's position was so weak and Ottoman determination so strong that its survival required more than ordinary endurance. It required a miracle. Many inside the city prayed for one, but history did not give it. That is what makes the fall so emotionally difficult. Human beings often believe that age, beauty, faith, and courage should count as protection. Constantinople had all of these. It was old. It was beautiful. It was sacred to its people. Its defenders were brave. Its walls had proved themselves for centuries, yet none of that saved it. The world does not always spare what deserves to be remembered. Sometimes memory is all that remains because rescue never came. But memory is not nothing. Memory shaped how later generations understood the fall. Greek laments, Western accounts, Ottoman chronicles, religious interpretations, nationalist histories, modern scholarship, and popular imagination all returned to 1453 for different reasons. Each age finds in the fall what it fears or admires. The end of empire, the rise of Islam, the failure of Christian unity, the power of technology, the tragedy of decline, the heroism of last stands, the inevitability of change, the birth of Istanbul, the death of Byzantium. Great events become mirrors. People look at Constantinople and see their own anxieties. A weakening society may see warning. A rising society may see ambition. A religious community may see sacred loss or fulfillment. A military historian may see artillery and walls. A political historian may see state capacity. A storyteller may see the last emperor. A traveler may see the city between continents. A tired listener at night may hear something quieter, the sound of all human things passing, even those built to endure. That is why this topic belongs to sleep history. Not because it is soft, it is not, but because it has depth, rhythm, and darkness. It allows the mind to drift through walls, water, firelight, prayer, memory, and time. It is grand enough to hold attention, but old enough to become almost dreamlike. The final night of Constantinople is terrifying, but in the distance of centuries it becomes a meditation. What do people do when they know the morning may end their world? They repair the walls, they pray, they stand watch, they comfort children, they speak final words, they wait, they hope for ships, they listen to the enemy, they remember better days, they choose whether to stay. They become part of history before they know how history will name them. For the defenders, the answer was to remain. For maimed, the answer was to press forward. For the city, the answer was to absorb the blow and become something else. For memory, the answer was to keep returning. And so we return again, to the walls before dawn, the damaged stones, the defenders waiting with tired hands. The Ottoman camp glowing beyond the moat, the cannon resting after weeks of thunder, the emperor moving through darkness, the priests praying beneath domes, the people listening for the first signs of assault, the city, wounded but upright, standing between its past and its end. When the attack came, it broke more than masonry. It broke a chain of imperial continuity stretching back to Rome. But it also forged a new chain, Ottoman Constantinople, Imperial Istanbul, a city that would carry another empire's dreams for centuries. This is why the fall feels like a door closing and opening at the same time. One side hears a funeral bell. The other hears a victory drum. History hears both. In the centuries that followed, the old Byzantine world would be studied, mourned, misunderstood, rediscovered, admired, and debated. For a long time in Western scholarship, Byzantium was unfairly dismissed as decadent or stagnant, a faded continuation of Rome rather than a civilization of depth and originality. Modern scholarship has done much to correct that picture. Byzantium was not merely a long decline. It was adaptive, resilient, complex, and influential. Its fall was the end of a real civilization, not the closing of an embarrassing footnote. The people of Constantinople did not live in a footnote. They lived in a world of ceremonies, markets, icons, laws, schools, arguments, kitchens, ships, marriages, funerals, ambition, devotion, corruption, beauty, fear, and hope. Their city deserves to be remembered as living before it is remembered as fallen. That is important. If we only see Constantinople as doomed, we steal its life. So before the final night fades completely from our imagination, let us see the city not only as a victim of conquest, but as it was across time. Glittering in ceremony, crowded in markets, echoing with hymns, guarded by walls, filled with political intrigue, shaped by sea wind, lit by mosaics, shaken by riots, enriched by trade, wounded by crusaders, restored by stubborn rulers, thinned by decline, and still proud enough in its last hour to stand. A city does not need to win forever to have mattered. Constantinople mattered because it endured. It mattered because it preserved. It mattered because it connected. It mattered because it transformed the ancient Roman inheritance into a medieval Christian empire unlike any other. It mattered because even in weakness, it drew the ambition of conquerors. And it mattered because when it fell, the world noticed. As evening gathers over this part of the story, we can imagine the city long after 1453, no longer in flames, no longer freshly conquered, but alive under Ottoman rule. The skyline has changed. Minarets rise. Markets are busy. The palace of the Sultan commands attention. Hagia Sophia serves a new faith. The harbors move with trade. The walls still stand, scarred but majestic. Greek Christians, Muslims, Jews, Armenians, merchants, soldiers, scholars, officials, and travelers all move through the city's life. The old empire is gone, but the city has not become silent. It has become layered. And somewhere beneath those layers, if one listens closely, the last night remains. Not as daily grief for everyone who lives there now, not as visible wound in every street, but as deep memory. The memory of a city that once believed its walls could hold forever. The memory of a young sultan who proved they could not. The memory of an emperor who stayed when there was no victory left. The memory of a dome that changed meaning but not shape. The memory of Rome's last dawn in the East. And the memory of the truth that every empire, no matter how sacred, no matter how ancient, no matter how beautiful, lives inside time. Time does not hate empires. It simply outlasts them. Constantinople was no exception. It stood for more than 1,000 years as the Roman world's eastern flame. Then, in 1453, that flame passed into smoke, and from the smoke another imperial fire began to burn. It stood for more than 1,000 years as the Roman world's eastern flame. Then, in 1453, that flame passed into smoke, and from the smoke another imperial fire began to burn. But no fire burns without shadows. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople became one of the great triumphs of the 15th century, yet even triumph must settle into administration, law, labor, and daily life. The first image of conquest is dramatic. Soldiers entering, banners changing, the Sultan riding into the city, Hagia Sophia transformed, the last emperor gone. But after every conquest, someone has to repair the gates. Someone has to clean the streets. Someone has to count the surviving households. Someone has to reopen the markets. Someone has to decide who owns which house, which church, which shop, which field, which dock, which storehouse, which memory. Victory begins with noise. Rule begins with paperwork. Mehmed understood this better than a careless conqueror would have. He had not taken Constantinople only to enjoy a moment of glory. He wanted a capital worthy of empire. The city had to be made useful, beautiful, populated, obedient, and symbolic. A ruined prize would not serve him. An empty city would not feed his ambition. A dead Constantinople would give him a name, but a living Constantinople could give him a world. So the work of transformation began. This transformation was not gentle, but it was deliberate. Conquered buildings were reassigned. Sacred spaces changed function. People were resettled. Communities were organized. New institutions were founded. Ottoman authority entered the streets not only through soldiers, but through judges, officials, religious leaders, craftsmen, merchants, builders, and households. The city that had been taken by force now had to be held by structure. This is one of the hardest things to understand about empires. They are not only made in battles. They are made afterward, in the slow work of making people live under a new order. The Ottoman state had to turn conquest into normal life. Normal life is powerful. It has a way of making even impossible changes feel permanent. At first, a conquered city lives in shock. People whisper. They search for the missing. They look at buildings that no longer mean what they meant. They learn which soldiers are dangerous, which officials can be bribed, which streets are safe, which churches remain open, which shops can reopen, which neighbors are gone, which doors now belong to someone else. Then weeks pass, then months, then years. Children grow. The new ruler's coins circulate. Taxes are paid. Markets reopen. New houses fill old spaces. New prayers mark time. The sound of conquest becomes the sound of government. And the city, though still carrying grief, begins to live in the language of the conqueror. For the Christians who remained, adaptation did not mean forgetting. It meant survival. The Orthodox Church continued, but under conditions completely different from the old imperial order. The Patriarch no longer stood beside a Christian emperor in a Roman capital. He stood under a Muslim sultan who had conquered the city. This changed everything. Religious life continued, but political theology had to adjust to humiliation. The old harmony between emperor, church, and city had been broken. Yet survival itself became meaningful. To keep praying when empire is gone is a form of endurance. To baptize children under a new ruler is to say that history has not ended. To preserve icons, liturgy, language, and memory inside changed conditions is a quiet victory of another kind. The Orthodox community did not recover the empire, but it preserved identity. That preservation mattered deeply across centuries. Political power can collapse quickly, but religious memory can outlive armies because it enters the calendar. The home, the song, the fast, the feast, the funeral, the name given to a child, the icon kissed in a quiet room. The empire had lost its palace, but memory still had churches. For the Muslim population of the new Ottoman capital, the city opened as a place of opportunity and destiny. Families arrived from other regions. Soldiers became settlers. Officials took posts. Scholars came. Craftsmen worked. Builders began to reshape the skyline. The city's transformation into an Islamic imperial capital was not only a political act. It was an urban and spiritual project. Mosques rose as signs of faith and power. Markets revived as signs of life. Schools and charitable foundations gave structure to the city. Baths, kitchens, fountains, and public buildings helped make Ottoman rule visible not only as command, but as civilization. The new city needed beauty too. Empire does not live by force alone. It wants to be admired. It wants subjects and visitors to feel that its rule has order, generosity, sacred legitimacy, and permanence. The Ottomans understood the power of architecture in this way, just as the Byzantines had before them. A dome can preach authority without words. A courtyard can organize community. A fountain can make rules seem merciful. A mosque complex can show that the Sultan feeds bodies, trains minds, and serves God. The Byzantine emperors had once used ceremony, gold, mosaics, and sacred architecture to make imperial power visible. The Ottoman sultans would use their own forms. Different faith, different language, different imperial order, same city, same human need to make power visible. Over time, the skyline began to change. Hagia Sophia remained, but it was joined by Ottoman mosques and complexes that gradually created one of the most recognizable cityscapes in the world. Domes and minarets rose over the hills. The city began to speak in Ottoman architectural grammar, yet the old Byzantine forms had not completely vanished. Some were absorbed, some inspired, some were covered, some stood in ruin. Some were transformed. The new skyline was not a clean erasure. It was an argument with the past. The city's stones had learned another language. The Sultan's palace also mattered. Power needed a home. The old Byzantine imperial palaces were damaged, diminished, or unsuitable for the new Ottoman vision. Mehmed and his successors developed new palace spaces, eventually including the great Topkapi Palace, positioned dramatically near the meeting of waters. From there, Ottoman rulers governed an empire that would stretch across continents. The palace embodied a new center of gravity. The old Roman emperor had vanished at the walls. The Ottoman Sultan now looked out over the city of emperors. But every palace has servants. Every imperial chamber has guards. Every court ceremony has people arranging carpets, clothing, documents, food, messages, weapons, lamps, doors, and silence. Just as the Byzantine court had depended on invisible labor, the Ottoman court did too. Empires change names, but power always requires hands. This is why the afterlife of Constantinople is not only a story of rulers. It is a story of workers rebuilding normality after catastrophe, stonecutters repairing walls, carpenters replacing doors, merchants reopening shops, sailors returning to harbors, women managing households through uncertainty, children learning new sounds in the streets, religious leaders negotiating boundaries, scribes recording new orders, judges hearing disputes, soldiers guarding the city they helped take. The world after 1453 did not become calm. It became organized. There is a difference. Order can exist with grief beneath it. A market can be busy in a city where families still mourn. A mosque can be full where a church once stood. A tax record can be neat while the human story behind it is broken. Administration is often emotionally cold because it must make catastrophe legible. Names, properties, districts, revenues, obligations, permissions, all of these turn upheaval into a system. For the historian, such records are valuable. For the people inside them, they were life being rearranged. Imagine a family that survived the conquest but lost relatives, property, or security. A new official arrives. Claims must be made. Payments demanded. New rules learned. Perhaps the family remains Christian. Perhaps they live in a neighborhood where others speak their language and share their faith. Perhaps they have a trade useful enough to preserve their position. Perhaps they are poorer now. Perhaps they are frightened. Yet they still wake, cook, repair, bargain, pray, and teach children. Their grief becomes domestic. It sits beside the bread. It hides in stories told at night. It appears when an elder says, "Before the city fell." Those words must have carried enormous weight. Before the city fell, this church was ours. Before the city fell, the emperor still lived. Before the city fell, my father had a shop there. Before the city fell, we thought help might come. Before the city fell, the bells sounded differently. Every conquered people has phrases like this. They mark the border between lived memory and historical rupture. At first, the phrase is spoken by witnesses. Later, by their children. Then by grandchildren who know the event only through inherited sadness. Eventually, it becomes part of identity. Not daily pain, perhaps, but ancestral pain. The Ottomans had their own phrase in spirit after the conquest. After the conquest, the city became ours. After the conquest, the Sultan became great. After the conquest, the empire had its true capital. After the conquest, the roads of power led here. After the conquest, the old prophecy was fulfilled. For one community, before and after divided loss. For another, before and after divided destiny. Both lived in the same city. This is why Constantinople after 1453 was not simply renamed by power. It had to carry different calendars of memory. Christians remembered feast days and losses. Muslims celebrated conquest and new foundations. Merchants remembered opportunities. Officials remembered orders. Travelers remembered marvels. The city became a place where memory did not agree with itself. Great cities rarely have one memory. They have competing memories that share streets. The Jewish communities of the Ottoman world also became part of the city's life. Over time, especially after the expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492, Ottoman lands received Sephardic Jewish refugees, many of whom brought skills, trade networks, languages, and cultural traditions. Istanbul became one of the important centers of Jewish life in the Ottoman Empire. This later development shows how the city continued to absorb the consequences of events far beyond its own walls. A city at the center of empire becomes a magnet for displaced people. The same city that created refugees in 1453 would later receive refugees from elsewhere. History is never morally simple. It moves suffering across maps in uneven ways. For merchants, Ottoman Constantinople offered immense possibilities. Its position between seas and continents made it a natural hub. Trade routes changed over time, and the rise of Ottoman power affected Mediterranean commerce, but the city remained commercially vital. Goods flowed through markets and ports: grain, fish, timber, cloth, spices, metals, leather, ceramics, slaves, luxury items, and everyday necessities. Markets are where empire becomes touchable. A soldier may win a city. A merchant helps keep it alive. The bazaar, the dock, the workshop, the warehouse, the caravan route, the money changer's table, these are quieter than cannon, but they shape the life of a capital. In Ottoman Istanbul, economic life helped restore the city's pulse. People from many backgrounds met through exchange, bargaining, debt, trust, and competition. Commerce did what politics could not always do. It made enemies and strangers useful to one another. Not equal, not always peaceful, but useful. And usefulness can become a form of coexistence. The city's physical recovery also required water. Constantinople had long depended on cisterns, aqueducts, channels, and careful water management. The old Roman and Byzantine infrastructure remained important, though damaged or adapted. Water is one of the most unglamorous foundations of urban survival. A city can have domes and walls, but if water fails, glory dries up quickly. In the underground cisterns, the old world continued in darkness. Columns stood in cool silence. Water reflected dim light. These spaces had no concern for whether emperors or sultans ruled above. They simply held the resource that made city life possible. Some of the deepest continuities in history are practical. People may change banners, faiths, and languages, but they still need water, bread, shelter, and waste removed. Civilization rests on these humble systems. The fall of Constantinople changed the meaning of the city, but not the needs of the human body. This is why daily life after conquest is so important. It reminds us that history is lived below the level of ideology. A child does not understand imperial legitimacy first. A child understands hunger, fear, warmth, language, parents, neighbors, and street sounds. The new Ottoman city formed itself in such experiences. Children born after the conquest learned the city not as fallen, but as home. They knew the call to prayer as part of the soundscape. They saw Ottoman soldiers and officials as normal. They may have heard elders speak Greek, Turkish, Armenian, Ladino, or other languages. They grew up among layers they did not yet know were layers. The past becomes invisible when one is born inside its aftermath. Only later does someone teach you that a building used to mean something else, that a gate was once breached, that a church was once the heart of an empire, that the walls held for centuries, that the emperor died, that the city had another name in another mouth. The child then inherits memory secondhand, and secondhand memory can become powerful in a different way. It is less sharp than experience, but more shaped. It can be turned into identity, story, grievance, pride, or myth. Witnesses remember confusion. Descendants remember meaning. Byzantine memory after 1453 gradually became more symbolic. The real empire had been complicated, full of political conflicts, theological disputes, court violence, economic weakness, military failures, and social tension. But lost empires often become cleaner in memory. People remember golden domes, holy emperors, brave last stands, and sacred tragedy. They remember less often the bureaucracy, taxation, factionalism, and compromises that filled daily life. This is natural, but incomplete. The lost city becomes beautiful because it is lost. The conquered city becomes sacred because it cannot be recovered. Yet the honest story is more powerful than the polished one. Constantinople was magnificent and flawed. Byzantine politics could be ruthless. Religious life could be profound and divisive. The empire could be brilliant and exhausted. Its people could be brave and quarrelsome, faithful and fearful, cultured and practical. It was not a perfect Christian city destroyed by history. It was a human civilization, and that makes its fall more moving, not less. Perfect things do not exist. Human things do, and human things can still be precious. For the Ottomans, the conquest also became polished by memory. Mehmed's victory was remembered with grandeur, religious meaning, military genius, and imperial pride. Yet it too had practical and brutal realities: enormous preparation, bloodshed, plunder, administrative difficulty, resettlement, political calculation, and the challenge of ruling a complex city. Ottoman memory could make the conquest glorious, but glory also has labor beneath it. The Sultan's greatness rested on engineers, soldiers, sailors, gunners, supply workers, officials, religious figures, and countless unnamed people who made conquest possible. No empire is built by one man alone, but one man can become the face of what many made possible. Mehmed became that face. Constantine XI became the face of the other side, not of power at its height, but of power refusing to abandon its final duty. His legend survived because he was not victorious. Victory often builds monuments. Defeat builds longing. The last emperor's disappearance allowed people to imagine him beyond death, hidden, sleeping, waiting. The idea of a sleeping or returning ruler appears in many cultures because people struggle to accept final loss. If the emperor is only dead, the story is over. If he sleeps, hope remains. Such legends are not historical evidence in the ordinary sense. They are emotional evidence. They tell us what people needed to believe. They reveal the wound left by the fall. A community that imagines its last emperor sleeping under a gate or mountain is a community refusing to let history have the final word. But history did have the final word politically. The Byzantine Empire did not return. The Ottoman Empire held the city. The world moved on. This tension between longing and reality gives the fall its lasting ache. People can remember, dream, and pray, but the map does not always change back. Generations may inherit hope without seeing restoration. The city can remain sacred in imagination while belonging to another power in fact. That is the pain of lost capitals. They are never only places. They are imagined homes for worlds that no longer exist. For Greeks and Orthodox Christians, Constantinople became such a place. For Ottomans and later Turks, Istanbul became a center of imperial pride and historical identity. For Western Europeans, it became a symbol of the end of Byzantium, the advance of Ottoman power, and the fragility of Christendom. For historians, it became a turning point debated endlessly. For travelers, it became a city of wonders. For poets, a city of loss. For rulers, a prize. For ordinary residents, simply home. The same city holds all these meanings because cities are larger than any one story told about them. As the decades passed after 1453, the immediate memory of the siege became history. Survivors aged. Children became adults. New buildings rose. New rulers sat in the city. The Ottoman Empire expanded further, then faced its own challenges in later centuries. The Byzantine past remained present in stone and story, but the living rhythm became Ottoman. The city's energy did not come from mourning forever. It came from adaptation. Adaptation is not betrayal. It is how people live. A Christian artisan who worked under Ottoman rule was not necessarily forgetting Byzantium. He was feeding his family. A Muslim builder who raised a mosque was not thinking only of conquest. He was making sacred space. A Jewish refugee arriving later was not entering a Byzantine wound first. He was seeking survival. A merchant was not solving history. He was moving goods. Daily life has its own urgency. This is why fallen cities are never simple memorials. They become homes again. The historian must hold grief and normality together. It is tempting to keep Constantinople frozen at the moment of fall because drama lives there. The emperor in battle. The walls breached. Hagia Sophia crowded, maimed entering. But the city's later life is equally important because it shows the deepest truth of history. Endings become foundations for other people's beginnings. The Byzantine ending became an Ottoman beginning. The Ottoman beginning became centuries of new life. And eventually, the Ottoman world too would face its own decline, reforms, crises, wars, and end. The city would outlive that empire as well. This long view humbles every claim of permanence. Rome thought itself eternal. Byzantium thought itself protected. The Ottomans built an empire that seemed immense. Modern states claim their own certainties, but the city has seen too much to believe any human order is forever. Its hills, waters, and stones have watched power arrive in procession and leave in memory. That may be the deepest lesson of Constantinople. The place endures longer than the systems that claim it, but even places change. The modern city is not ancient Constantinople, not Byzantine Constantinople, not exactly Ottoman Istanbul either. It contains them, but it is also something else. That is how time works. It does not preserve the past like a sealed room. It transforms it into layers, fragments, continuities, ruins, names, rituals, and arguments. To walk through such a city is to walk through time that refuses to stay in order. A Byzantine column may stand near an Ottoman mosque. A Roman wall may run beside a modern road. A church may have become a mosque, then a museum, then a mosque again. A cistern may become a place of visitors and lights. A palace ruin may be known mostly to scholars. A gate may carry a legend about an emperor. The city is never finished explaining itself. For our quiet journey, however, we return one last time to the emotional center, the human beings caught between walls and history. Imagine an old Byzantine scholar after the conquest, preserving a manuscript not because he believes it will restore the empire, but because it must not be lost. Imagine an Ottoman builder measuring foundations for a new structure, unaware that future centuries will see his work as part of a golden age. Imagine a Christian mother teaching her child prayers in a city where the great church has changed. Imagine a Muslim family arriving from elsewhere, seeing the city as promise. Imagine a merchant reopening a stall because bread must be bought and sold even after empires die. These people did not live in our categories. They lived in days, and days are made of small tasks. The final fall of Constantinople is grand history, but its aftermath is a human landscape of adjustment. That is why it deserves slow telling. Fast history rushes from canon to conquest to consequence, but slow history asks what the air felt like after the smoke thinned, what the streets sounded like when people came out again, what grief does when it must share space with markets, what victory does when it must become governance, what memory does when it cannot change the outcome. In that quiet space, the story becomes deeper. The fall of Constantinople was not the end of civilization. It was the end of one civilization's political world and the rise of another imperial order in the same city. That difference matters. It prevents us from turning history into simple ruin. It allows us to mourn Byzantium without denying Ottoman greatness. It allows us to admire Ottoman achievement without forgetting Byzantine loss. It allows us to see the city not as a trophy passed between abstractions, but as a living place full of people. And people are always more complicated than banners. As night falls over the Ottoman capital decades after the conquest, the city glows again. Not with the same light as before, but with light. Lamps burn in houses, markets quiet, ships rock in the harbor, guards stand at gates, prayers rise in mosques. Prayers rise in churches, families eat, dogs move through alleys, the walls stand dark and scarred. Hagia Sophia, changed but still immense, catches the last trace of evening. A traveler looking from across the water might see only beauty. A survivor might see ghosts. A new settler might see opportunity. A ruler might see destiny. A historian sees layers. And beneath them all, the Bosporus moves, indifferent and eternal in appearance, carrying reflections of every empire that ever believed it owned the city. The water does not mourn. The stones do not celebrate, but people do both. And that is why Constantinople remains unforgettable, because it holds mourning and celebration in the same frame. The city fell. The city lived. The empire ended. The empire began. The bell faded. The call rose. The walls broke. The memory endured. And in the long sleep of history, Constantinople remained what it had always been. A place where the world changed hands without ever becoming simple. And in the long sleep of history, Constantinople remained what it had always been. A place where the world changed hands without ever becoming simple. But the story of its fall does not end with the city alone. It spreads outward into Europe, into the Islamic world, into the Orthodox imagination, into maps, trade routes, military planning, scholarship, prophecy, fear, and ambition. When Constantinople fell in 1453, the stones broke in one place, but the echo moved across many lands. Some heard it as disaster, some as warning, some as victory, some as opportunity. some as proof that the age of old walls was ending, some as proof that God had favored one side and judged another. Great events do not stay where they happen. They travel through interpretation. In Christian Europe, news of the fall arrived like a wound and an accusation. The great city of the Eastern Christians, the old Roman capital, the guardian of the Bosporus, had been taken. Some people mourned sincerely. Some wrote in alarm. Some called for crusade. Some asked why help had not come sooner. Some blamed the Byzantines for refusing deeper union with Rome. Some blamed Western rulers for hesitation and selfish politics. Some saw the fall as divine punishment for sin and disunity. Some saw it as a military lesson. Some saw it as the beginning of a new Ottoman threat pressing toward Europe. But grief did not produce unity. That was part of the tragedy. Western Europe in the 15th century was not one united Christian body ready to act with a single will. It was divided by kingdoms, rivalries, local wars, dynastic concerns, economic interests, church politics, and exhaustion. The idea of crusade still existed, but the old crusading energy had changed. Rulers might speak of response, but their own problems came first. Venice and Genoa thought of trade as well as faith. Kings thought of rivals. Popes thought of authority. Armies cost money. Promises were easier than ships. Constantinople had needed help before the walls fell. Afterward, words could not rebuild them. This is one of history's cold lessons. Many disasters are recognized fully only when they are already complete. People warn, others hesitate. Interests conflict. Aid is debated. The threatened place continues to weaken. Then, when the end comes, the world says it was terrible, inevitable, shocking, tragic. But the moment for rescue has passed. The defenders of Constantinople discovered this before dawn. They stood on the wall with too little help and too much history behind them. For Western Europeans, the fall also sharpened awareness of Ottoman power. The Ottomans were no longer simply one Eastern force among many. They were rulers of Constantinople. They possessed the city of Constantine. They controlled a strategic crossing between continents. Their armies had shown discipline, artillery, organization, and ambition. The psychological effect mattered. Europe had to imagine an Ottoman Empire seated in the old Roman East, looking toward the Balkans, the Mediterranean, and beyond. Fear can redraw mental maps before armies redraw political ones. The fall of Constantinople helped make Ottoman expansion feel like a central problem of European politics. In the decades and centuries that followed, Ottoman power would press into southeastern Europe, compete in the Mediterranean, challenge Habsburg power, and become deeply entangled in European diplomacy and war. 1453 did not create Ottoman strength from nothing, but it announced that strength in unforgettable form. The city became a message. Mehmed had taken what many thought impossible. After that, no wall in Europe could feel quite the same. The military lesson was obvious and unsettling. Artillery had changed siege warfare. Again, we must not exaggerate as if every castle and wall became useless immediately. Fortifications continued to matter. Engineers adapted. Cities and states built new forms of defense. But the fall of Constantinople became a symbol of the new age of gunpowder. Enormous walls, sacred reputation, ancient prestige, none could ignore cannon. The sound that broke the Theodosian Walls echoed in every fortress owner's mind. Stone could still resist, but stone had to chain. This mattered for the future of warfare. The medieval world of high walls, towers, and vertical defense gradually gave way to new military architecture. Lower, thicker, angled fortifications, bastions, earthworks, and designs meant to absorb artillery. War became more expensive. States needed more money, engineers, supply systems, professional soldiers, and administrative capacity. The age of small local lords fighting from private castles did not disappear everywhere at once, but the direction of power moved toward larger organized states. In that sense, Constantinople's fall belongs not only to Byzantine or Ottoman history, but to the transformation of Europe's military and political order. The cannon did not simply break walls. It helped strengthen states that could afford cannon. Technology favors those who can organize it. Maimed could organize it. That was decisive. But technology alone is never destiny. The Byzantines themselves understood artillery and sought their own resources. The problem was not ignorance, it was weakness. They lacked the money, manpower, and strategic depth to match Ottoman pressure. This is another recurring truth. Societies often know what they need but cannot afford it, produce it, or coordinate it in time. Knowledge without capacity becomes tragedy. The fall of Constantinople also shifted trade imagination. For centuries, the city had been tied to routes connecting the Black Sea, Mediterranean, and Eastern goods. The Ottoman conquest did not close all trade between East and West, as simplified stories sometimes claim. Venetian, Genoese, and other merchants continued to trade with Ottoman lands in different ways. But the political conditions changed. The Eastern Mediterranean now operated under a stronger Ottoman presence. Access, taxes, privileges, rivalries, and risks had to be renegotiated. Later generations sometimes connected the Ottoman rise and changing Eastern trade conditions with European exploration across the Atlantic and around Africa. The reality is complex. Europeans sought sea routes for many reasons: profit, competition, access to spices and luxury goods, religious ambition, technology, navigation, and the desire to bypass intermediaries. The fall of Constantinople was not the single cause of the age of exploration, but it belonged to the wider atmosphere in which Western Europeans increasingly looked for alternate routes and new advantages. History rarely has one cause. It has pressure systems. 1453 was one pressure in a world already changing. For scholars and humanists, the fall carried another meaning. Greek scholars, manuscripts, and intellectual traditions had been moving west before 1453, especially through contacts between Byzantium and Italy. But the conquest gave this movement drama and urgency. Byzantine immigrés taught Greek, copied texts, explained ancient authors, and contributed to the growing humanist fascination with classical learning. Western Europe's intellectual renewal did not depend only on Byzantine refugees, but their role mattered. Imagine a scholar carrying a manuscript away from a world under threat. The book may contain Plato, Aristotle, Homer, church fathers, historians, grammar, medicine, or mathematics. It is only parchment, ink, and binding. It can be burned, stolen, soaked, lost at sea, sold, copied, misunderstood, or forgotten. But if it survives, it can change minds centuries after the army that endangered it is gone. The fall of Constantinople reminds us that books are also refugees. They flee in human hands. They cross borders. They survive because someone thinks they are worth carrying. In Italy, Greek learning became part of humanist culture. Teachers from the Byzantine world helped Western scholars approach ancient texts in their original language. Manuscript collections grew. Printing, which would soon transform Europe, later multiplied texts in ways Byzantine scribes could hardly imagine. The Old Eastern Empire's scholarly traditions entered new technological and cultural systems. A civilization can lose its capital and still shape the future through its books. That is one of Byzantium's quiet victories. But again, Byzantium should not be valued only because it fed the West. That would make it a servant to another story. Byzantium mattered in itself. Its art, theology, law, diplomacy, administration, military strategy, literature, and spiritual life shaped centuries. The fall was not important only because some scholars went to Italy. It was important because a living civilization with its own center had been conquered. The manuscripts are part of the afterlife, not the whole soul. In the Islamic world, Mehmed's conquest carried enormous prestige. Constantinople had been a legendary objective for Muslim rulers for centuries. Earlier Arab sieges had failed. The city's endurance had made it almost mythic. To take it was to step into a long line of ambition and finally succeed where others had not. For Ottoman legitimacy, this mattered deeply. Mehmed could present himself as a ruler favored by victory, a champion of Islam, and a sovereign whose empire now possessed one of the world's great cities. The conquest strengthened the Ottoman claim to leadership, but the Ottoman Empire was also pragmatic. It ruled over Muslims, Christians, Jews, and many ethnic communities. Its strength came not only from religious zeal, but from administrative skill, military organization, legal systems, taxation, diplomacy, and the ability to incorporate difference under hierarchy. Constantinople's transformation into Istanbul was therefore not simply a religious victory, it was a state-building project. Ottoman greatness after 1453 rested on the ability to turn conquest into functioning empire. That is a rarer skill than conquest itself. Many armies can destroy. Fewer can govern. Mehmed's legacy endured because he did both. He took the city, then made it central. He did not merely break Byzantine Constantinople. He began building Ottoman Constantinople. Later sultans would expand this work until the city became one of the most magnificent capitals of the early modern world. The conquest was the door. The empire had to furnish the room. For the Orthodox world under Ottoman rule, the city's fall became a spiritual turning point. Without an emperor, the Patriarchate became a central institution for organizing Orthodox Christian life within the Ottoman system. The Church carried communal identity through centuries. In some ways, the loss of empire made religious identity even more important. Political sovereignty was gone, but liturgical continuity remained. The calendar became a homeland. Feast days, fasts, saints, icons, prayers, and language could preserve belonging when the palace could not. This is why conquered communities so often cling to religious rhythms. They give time a familiar shape when political space has changed. A person who can no longer live under his own ruler can still enter a church and hear words his grandparents heard. That continuity matters. It does not undo conquest, but it prevents total erasure. For Greek memory, Constantinople became the lost city, the queen of cities, the symbol of a world interrupted. The longing for the city would remain powerful across centuries, eventually feeding nationalist dreams and political visions much later. But in the immediate aftermath, longing was not yet ideology. It was grief and survival. People did not first mourn as nations. They mourned as families, communities, believers, and witnesses. Later centuries organized grief into larger stories. The fall of Constantinople also affected how people thought about Rome. Rome had already meant many things by 1453. The old Western city, the papal city, the ancient empire, the legal and imperial tradition, the Eastern Roman state, the German Holy Roman Empire in the West. The idea of Rome was scattered across geography and politics. When Constantinople fell, one of the strongest living claims to Roman continuity ended as a state. But Rome did not disappear as an idea. Ideas are harder to conquer than cities. The Ottomans themselves used Roman imperial language in certain ways, claiming inheritance through possession of the city. The Russians would develop claims related to Orthodox succession. Western Europeans had their own Roman inheritance through law, church, empire, and classical learning. Rome after 1453 became even more ghostly and contested because the city that had carried its Eastern imperial body was gone. The fall of Constantinople did not end Rome's memory. It released it into even more competing forms. This is why historical labels matter. Modern people often say Byzantine Empire, but its people called themselves Romans. The term Byzantine came later, used by historians to distinguish the medieval Eastern Empire from ancient Rome. It is useful, but it can mislead. If we imagine Byzantium as something separate and exotic, we miss the emotional force of 1453. The people inside Constantinople were not defending an empire they thought of as a scholarly footnote called Byzantium. They were defending Roman continuity. The last emperor was not, in his own imagination, the last Byzantine emperor. He was the Roman emperor. This changes the feeling of the fall. It was not just a medieval Greek state being conquered. It was the final political fall of the Roman imperial tradition in the East. The empire of Augustus had transformed beyond recognition, Christianized, Greek-speaking, Eastern, theological, bureaucratic, and medieval, but still Roman to itself. When Constantine XI died, something that had begun in antiquity finally lost its crown. That is why the story feels so deep. The fall also changed Ottoman self-understanding. By ruling Constantinople, Mehmed could claim a universal role, not merely tribal, regional, or dynastic power. The city encouraged imperial ambition because it had always been a universal stage. To sit in Constantinople was to imagine rule across worlds. Later Ottoman sultans would govern from that position with increasing grandeur, projecting power into Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Mediterranean. The city did not make the Ottomans great by itself, but it gave their greatness a center. A center matters because empires need places where power can be seen. Soldiers may hold frontiers, governors may manage provinces, merchants may move wealth, but capitals gather meaning. They turn scattered control into a visible order. Constantinople, Istanbul became that order for the Ottomans. The old Byzantine city gave its conquerors a capital with unmatched symbolic weight. This is another irony of conquest. The conquered city can strengthen the conqueror by giving him its past. Mehmed took the city, but the city gave him a role larger than the one he had before. In Europe, artists and writers would continue to imagine the fall. Some accounts emphasized horror and loss. Others admired Mehmed's power. Some used the fall as moral warning. Some connected it to end times expectation. The city's history became material for sermons, chronicles, diplomatic appeals, and later historical writing. The more distance grew, the more symbolic the event became. This is common with great falls. Troy, Rome, Jerusalem, Constantinople. Cities become more than places after they are lost or transformed. They become mirrors for whatever later generations fear losing. A powerful city falling tells every age, your walls may not hold either. For modern viewers, the fall of Constantinople carries another fascination. It feels cinematic because it has clear dramatic elements. A young conqueror, an old emperor, massive walls, giant cannons, a final night, a sacred monument, a city between continents, a last stand, a dawn assault, a vanished ruler, a transformation of world history. But if we tell it only cinematically, we risk losing its human quiet. The tired hands repairing walls, the hunger in houses. The debates over church union, the foreign soldier far from home, the Ottoman worker dragging ships or hauling cannon, the priest hearing confession, the mother listening for battle, the scholar hiding a book, the survivor learning a new order. These are the details that make the story real. History is not only made by the people whose names survive. It is endured by the people whose names are gone. The fall's global meaning came later. For those inside it, the event was immediate. The wall, the street, the family, the church, the enemy, the breath, the decision to run, hide, fight, pray, or wait. Only later did historians arrange the fall into chapters. End of the Middle Ages, rise of Ottoman power, gunpowder revolution, Renaissance scholarship, Eastern trade, Orthodox memory. These categories help us understand, but they were not how the morning felt. The morning felt like smoke, like broken doors, like fear, like a city no longer protected by its own story. Constantinople had believed, or at least hoped, that its story might protect it. It had survived so many sieges that survival seemed almost written into its identity. But identity is not armor. Reputation can delay enemies, frighten them, inspire defenders, and attract allies. But when cannons strike and men climb through breaches, reputation must become action. In 1453, the city's reputation was larger than its resources. That gap killed it. The same thing happens to empires, institutions, and people. A name can remain powerful after the body weakens. Others may still fear or respect the name. The owner of the name may still believe in it, but eventually, reality tests the gap. Constantinople's fall was the moment when its imperial name could no longer carry its material weakness. And yet, the name survived in memory. That is the paradox. The city lost power but gained myth. The empire lost territory but gained elegy. The emperor lost life but gained legend. The walls lost invincibility but gained eternal symbolism. This is why defeat sometimes becomes more emotionally enduring than victory. Ottoman victory created a living empire. Byzantine defeat created a haunting memory. The Ottoman Empire would have centuries of future glory, but the final Byzantine hour remains unforgettable because it compresses so much loss into one image. A last emperor at a broken wall. It is almost impossible not to remember. But we must also remember Mehmed, not as a simple villain in someone else's tragedy, but as one of history's extraordinary rulers. He was ambitious, ruthless, intelligent, learned, and visionary. He understood military technology, symbolism, politics, and urban destiny. He wanted Constantinople and pursued it with remarkable focus. His victory reshaped the region. His rebuilding gave the city a new life. To reduce him only to destroyer is historically weak. He destroyed the Byzantine Empire. He also built an Ottoman capital. Both are true. History is stronger when it refuses cartoon simplicity. The people on both sides believed in meaning. The Byzantines saw themselves as defenders of Christian Rome. The Ottomans saw themselves as fulfilling Islamic and imperial destiny. Both were heirs to traditions larger than themselves. Both prayed, both fought, both suffered losses, both remembered. One side lost the city, the other gained it. The moral and emotional meanings are not identical, but the human reality is shared. War turns human beings into sides. History must sometimes return them to persons. Imagine an Ottoman gunner after weeks of firing at the walls, his ears ringing, his hands burned or blackened, his body exhausted by labor. He knows the cannon is dangerous even to those who fire it. He has watched stone break under thunder. He has perhaps lost comrades. When the city falls, does he feel triumph? Relief? Awe, hunger. Does he enter the city or remain with the guns? We may not know his name, but men like him changed the world's military imagination. Imagine a Byzantine mason repairing the wall at night. He works with rubble, earth, timber, dust, and desperation. He may not be a famous soldier. He may not understand every political cause of the siege, but he understands that if the gap remains open, the city dies. His labor may hold the wall one more day. That day matters. History counts final outcomes, but human beings live inside the days before the outcome. One more day can be everything. Imagine a Venetian or Genoese defender fighting for a city not his own, yet tied by faith, honor, trade, and circumstance. He may mistrust the Greeks. The Greeks may mistrust him. But at the wall, distrust becomes secondary to survival. His blood falls on the same stones. The final defense of Constantinople was, in a small and tragic way, the Christian unity the city had struggled to achieve politically. It came too late and too small, but it came in blood. Imagine a monk in the city. He has heard arguments about union, doctrine, betrayal, prophecy, sin, and punishment. Now the canons speak louder than arguments. He prays for mercy because nothing else remains. If he survives, he will have to explain the fall to himself spiritually. If he dies, his last world is prayer under siege. These imagined figures remind us that the event was lived in fragments. No one person experienced the whole fall. The Sultan saw one version, the emperor another, a soldier another, a mother another, a priest another, a merchant another, a child another. Only later does history gather fragments and call them the fall of Constantinople. The phrase is useful, but it hides multiplicity. For your channel, this is the heart of the storytelling. Not just what happened, but what it felt like from many angles. The viewer should feel the walls, the sea, the prayers, the campfires, the dust, the silence after conquest, the long memory afterward. The story should not rush. It should move like night over the city, slow, dark, heavy, beautiful, and inevitable. The final meaning of 1453 is not that one civilization was good and another evil. That is too small. The final meaning is that history changes hands through force, weakness, vision, technology, faith, failure, and time. The Byzantines had inherited Rome and preserved it for 1,000 years. The Ottomans had risen with the strength to take the city and remake it. Both belonged to history's deep movement. One carried an old flame. One lit a new one. The city held the smoke of both. As we move toward the end of this long journey, the image of the final night returns again. It keeps returning because everything after it grows from it. The Ottoman capital, the Orthodox memory, the European shock, the military lesson, the scholarly migrations, the legends of the last emperor, all of it flows backward to those hours before dawn. The fires outside the walls, the candles inside the churches. The emperor among his men, the sultan in his camp, the cannons silent for a moment before the final storm, the defenders standing in damaged places, the city waiting. Perhaps that is why the story stays with us. Waiting is universal. Every person, every family, every civilization eventually waits for something it cannot fully control. A diagnosis, a war, a migration, a debt, a storm, a change of ruler, a morning that may not bring the same world. Constantinople's last night is an extreme version of a human condition, the knowledge that dawn may change everything. The city waited, and dawn came, the world changed. Yet even after the change, water moved through the Bosporus. Birds crossed the sky. The sun touched the dome. The walls cast shadows. People breathed. Someone cried. Someone prayed. Someone began to plan. Someone searched for bread. Someone looked at the city and called it conquered. Someone else looked and called it lost. History stood between them, listening. And the city, wounded and reborn, continued. And the city, wounded and reborn, continued. But beneath that continuation, something ancient had ended so completely that people would spend centuries trying to name what had been lost. Was it the end of Rome? The end of Byzantium? The end of the medieval world? The rise of Ottoman greatness? The closing of an old Christian empire? The beginning of a new imperial age between Europe and Asia? The answer is not one thing. It is all of them, depending on where we stand. That is why the fall of Constantinople remains so powerful. It refuses to stay inside one category. It is a military story because walls, cannons, ships, soldiers, commanders, and tactics decided the final hours. It is a religious story because churches, mosques, prayers, prophecy, sacred spaces, and theological wounds shaped how people understood it. It is a political story because empires rose and fell around it. It is a technological story because gunpowder helped change what stone could mean. It is a cultural story because books, scholars, art, memory, and identity traveled after the fall. And it is a human story because all of those large forces entered the lives of ordinary people. A city is never only a city. It is a container for everything people fear losing. For Constantinople, that container had been filled for more than 1,000 years. The city held the memory of Constantine the Great, who had chosen and remade it as a new imperial capital. It held the ceremonies of emperors who believed they stood at the center of a Christian Roman order. It held the glory of Hagia Sophia, where architecture seemed to dissolve into gold and light. It held the laws, arguments, prayers, markets, riots, triumphs, defeats, and daily routines of generations who called themselves Romans. It held scars from crusaders, fires, earthquakes, sieges, betrayals, and restorations. It held languages and peoples from across the known world. By 1453, much of that greatness had become memory. But memory can be stronger than marble. The people inside the city did not defend only houses and churches. They defended accumulated meaning. Every stone had ancestors behind it. Every gate had a story. Every church held prayers spoken by the dead. Every street carried some trace of vanished processions. The walls were not only military barriers, they were the edge of a world that still believed it had a right to exist. And outside stood Mehmed, who also believed history had chosen him. This is the tragic symmetry of the siege. Both sides carried destiny in their minds. The defenders believed they guarded the last inheritance of Christian Rome. The Ottomans believed they were fulfilling a long-awaited conquest and raising their empire into a new age. Neither side saw itself as merely ambitious or merely desperate. Each side believed the city's future belonged within a sacred and imperial story. When history becomes sacred to both sides, defeat becomes more than defeat. It becomes a wound in the meaning of the world. For the Byzantines, the wound was immense. Their emperor had fallen. Their capital had been taken. Their greatest church had been transformed. Their political world had ended. The empire that had survived Arabs, Bulgars, Persians, Rus, Crusaders, civil wars, plague, and economic decline had finally reached the end of endurance. The Roman state in the East, transformed but continuous in its own identity, was gone. For the Ottomans, the same moment was glory. The city of emperors was theirs. Mehmed had accomplished what earlier rulers had failed to do. The conquest gave the Ottomans a capital worthy of their ambitions and a symbolic inheritance that stretched beyond their previous horizons. Their empire could now speak from Constantinople, and that changed how the world heard it. One event. Two memories, one city, two futures. This is why we have to resist telling the story too quickly. If we rush, we turn it into a headline. Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453. That sentence is true, but it is too clean. It hides the long exhaustion of Byzantium, the ambition of Mehmed, the courage of defenders, the fear of civilians, the role of cannon, the failure of Western rescue, the sacred weight of Hagia Sophia, the transformation of the city, and the centuries of memory that followed. History's most important sentences often need to be slowed down. Constantinople fell. Inside that word fell, there is the sound of stone breaking under cannon. There is the smell of smoke near the walls. There is the darkness before dawn. There is the emperor's final decision to stay. There is Giustiniani wounded and the defense shaken. There are soldiers pushing through breaches. There are people running through streets. There are prayers beneath a dome. There is a sultan entering the city he had imagined. There is a church becoming a mosque. There is a Roman world losing its final crown. There is a new Ottoman capital beginning to breathe. All of that lives inside one word. Fell. The aftermath forced everyone to live with that word differently. For the survivors of Byzantium, it could mean grief, humiliation, adaptation, exile, silence, or stubborn memory. For Ottoman rulers and subjects, it could mean triumph, opportunity, divine favor, imperial expansion, and the beginning of a new center. For Western Europe, it could mean alarm, guilt, fascination, and the need to rethink the power balance of the Eastern Mediterranean. For later historians, it became a marker, sometimes too neatly placed between medieval and early modern worlds. But for the city itself, it meant transformation. The old Constantinople did not vanish under rubble. It became layered beneath the Ottoman city. The walls still stood. Hagia Sophia still stood. The cisterns still held darkness and water. The harbors still received ships. The hills still rose above the sea. The same winds crossed the Bosporus. The same gulls moved over the Golden Horn. People still cooked, traded, prayed, repaired, argued, and buried their dead. Cities are stubborn. They do not die simply because empires do, but they remember. They remember in strange ways. Not like a person remembers with a single mind, but through fragments. A reused stone, a converted church, a broken wall, a street name, a legend, a liturgy, an old manuscript, a rumor about the last emperor, a mosaic hidden beneath plaster, a gate associated with betrayal, a tower repaired after bombardment. The city's memory becomes distributed through objects and stories. No one person holds it all. To understand Constantinople, we must move through those fragments slowly. Begin at the walls. The Theodosian Walls had protected the city for centuries, and even after the fall, they remained one of the greatest symbols of its past. They had turned away enemies when the empire was stronger. They had given the city time in crisis after crisis. They had made Constantinople seem almost impossible to take. But in 1453, They were wounded not because they had been poorly made, but because history had learned new violence. Cannon did not make the walls meaningless. They made their old certainty impossible. That distinction matters. The walls had succeeded for an extraordinary length of time. They had bought the city centuries. No defense lasts forever, but few defenses had held the imagination of enemies for so long. Their failure in 1453 was dramatic precisely because their reputation was so great. If ordinary walls fall, no one is surprised. When the walls of Constantinople fall, the world listens. The walls are therefore both defeat and achievement. They failed at the end. But they had carried the city through 1,000 years. Now move to Hagia Sophia. No building better captures the city's layered destiny. Built under Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, it had been a wonder of Christian architecture, a statement of imperial and sacred ambition so powerful that later generations could hardly speak of Constantinople without speaking of it. Its vast dome, shimmering mosaics, marble light, and liturgy created an atmosphere meant to suggest heaven touching earth. It was not merely a church. It was a cosmological statement. It told worshippers that empire, faith, beauty, and divine order met in that space. When the city fell, Hagia Sophia's conversion into a mosque marked the conquest more deeply than any ordinary occupation could have done. It was a visible transfer of sacred centrality. The building continued, but its meaning changed. For Christians, that transformation was grief. For Muslims, it was victory and consecration. For historians, it is one of the clearest examples of how conquest claims the symbolic heart of a civilization. The dome remained above both memories. That is why Hagia Sophia is so charged. It refuses to belong only to one moment. It contains Byzantine ambition, Ottoman conquest, Islamic devotion, Christian longing, architectural genius, political struggle, and modern controversy. It is stone, but also argument. It is beauty, but also wound. It is continuity, but also rupture. In that sense, Hagia Sophia is Constantinople itself. Now move to the harbor. The Golden Horn had long been one of the city's great advantages, a sheltered harbor that helped make Constantinople wealthy and defensible. In the siege, it became a stage for Ottoman ingenuity when ships were moved overland into its waters. After the conquest, the harbor returned to commerce. Ships came and went. Goods moved. Sailors shouted. Ropes creaked. Fish were unloaded. Merchants counted profit. The same water that had reflected fear during the siege reflected ordinary life afterward. This is how cities heal, partly. Not by forgetting, but by returning to function. A harbor cannot mourn forever if ships need docking. A market cannot remain silent forever if people need bread. A street cannot stay a battlefield forever if children must walk through it. Practical life pushes history forward even when memory wants to remain at the site of loss. Now move to the palace. The old Byzantine imperial world had already been weakened before the conquest, but its disappearance after 1453 left a symbolic emptiness. The emperor had been the ceremonial heart of the Roman state. Without him, the old order had no earthly center. Mehmed filled that emptiness with Ottoman sovereignty. New palace spaces and imperial institutions would make the city the seat of another universal ambition. This is the pattern of imperial capitals. One court fades, another rises, and the city adjusts its posture. But court life, whether Byzantine or Ottoman, always depends on people who rarely become famous. Servants, cooks, guards, scribes, builders, messengers, stable workers, cleaners, water carriers, cloth workers, and countless others keep imperial grandeur alive. The difference between a palace and a ruin is often labor. If the labor stops, silk gathers dust, fires go out, horses go unfed, documents rot, and ceremony collapses. Power must be maintained daily or it becomes theater without actors. Now move to the ordinary streets. Here is where the fall mattered most intimately. The street is where conquest became personal. A soldier at a doorway, a family missing someone, a shop reopened under new rules, a child asking why a building changed, a priest moving carefully through a changed city, a Muslim settler learning the lanes of a new capital, a merchant deciding whether to stay, a widow bargaining for food, a craftsman repairing something broken during the siege. The street does not care about historical categories. It cares about survival. This is why the ordinary aftermath may be the most honest part of the story. The fall of Constantinople is famous because of emperors and sultans, walls and cannons, churches and mosques. But the city continued because ordinary people made it continue. They cooked, cleaned, traded, repaired, negotiated, raised children, buried the dead, learned new authorities, preserved old memories, and adapted to changed circumstances. Empires fall in public. Survival happens privately. And survival is not always heroic. Sometimes it is quiet compromise. Sometimes it is silence. Sometimes it is learning which official to approach. Sometimes it is accepting a new tax. Sometimes it is teaching a child old prayers while obeying new law. Sometimes it is selling goods to those whose arrival began with conquest. Sometimes it is rebuilding a house because there is nowhere else to go. History often asks ordinary people to live with decisions they did not make. The people of Constantinople after 1453 had to do exactly that. For those who left, exile created another form of survival. A refugee or scholar leaving the city carried memory into another land. Exile is more than travel. It is the breaking of the link between identity and place. A person can carry language, faith, books, and stories, but not the streets themselves. The old city becomes internal. It moves into longing. The exiled Byzantine world helped keep Constantinople alive outside Constantinople. In Italy and elsewhere, Greek scholars and texts shaped learning. In Orthodox lands, religious memory preserved continuity. In family stories, the lost city became a symbol. In liturgy, names and traditions remained. In legends, the last emperor did not fully die. In political dreams, the city remained desired. In scholarship, Byzantium became a subject of fascination and debate. The fallen city multiplied itself through memory. But memory can also change what it preserves. Over time, Byzantine Constantinople could become more glorious in imagination than it had been in its final years. The poverty, political division, abandoned spaces, and weakness of the 15th century city might fade behind the shining idea of the Queen of Cities. This is understandable. Loss often edits memory. It removes the dust and keeps the gold. But we should remember both. The city was glorious. The city was wounded. The city was sacred. The city was politically exhausted. The city was beautiful. The city was vulnerable. The city was defended bravely. The city could not be saved. Holding these truths together is the only way to honor it honestly. The Ottoman memory of conquest also grew. Maimed became Fatih, the conqueror. The date became foundational. The city's capture became part of imperial legitimacy and religious pride. Later generations could look back to 1453 as proof of Ottoman destiny. This too became memory shaped by power. The chaos, blood, fear, and administrative difficulty of the conquest could be polished into triumph. Victors also edit memory. They keep the glory and soften the cost. This does not make the glory false, but it makes it incomplete. The real conquest involved preparation, suffering, terror, courage, violence, and rebuilding. It involved men who died outside the walls and civilians who suffered inside them. It involved a sultan's vision and a city's trauma. It involved sacred transformation and political calculation. The polished version is easier to celebrate. The full version is harder, but more human, and more useful. Because if we learn anything from Constantinople, it should be that no civilization is made of one emotion. Byzantium was not only noble victim. The Ottomans were not only brutal conquerors. Western Europe was not only negligent spectator. The city was not only lost and not only reborn. Each part of the story contains contradictions. Good history does not fear contradiction. It walks into it. By walking into it, we see that the fall of Constantinople was not an isolated lightning strike. It was the visible endpoint of long patterns. Byzantine decline after the Fourth Crusade, Ottoman expansion in Anatolia and the Balkans, the growing importance of artillery, Western political fragmentation, religious distrust between Greek East and Latin West, economic weakness, population decline, strategic encirclement, Mehmed's determination, Constantine's limited resources, the walls' age and strength, the defenders' courage, the final accident, wound, breach, panic, and pressure of battle. All of these formed the road to 1453. The final assault was only the last step. This matters because people often look at fallen civilizations and ask, what was the one cause? There is rarely one cause. Civilizations fall when many weaknesses align with a strong enough external pressure. The final enemy may get the credit or blame, but collapse is usually prepared by time. Constantinople was conquered by Mehmed, but it had been weakened by centuries. This does not diminish the Ottoman achievement. It makes it clearer. Mehmed succeeded because he understood the moment. He saw that the city was still symbolically immense but materially vulnerable. He brought resources, artillery, organization, and ambition to that vulnerability. Great conquerors often succeed not only because they are strong, but because they recognize when a legendary target is weaker than its legend. He saw the gap between Constantinople's name and Constantinople's condition. Then he entered it with cannon. The defenders saw the same gap, but from the inside. They knew the city's weakness. Yet they also knew its meaning. They fought because meaning can compel action even when strategy offers little hope. Human beings do not defend only what is likely to survive. Sometimes they defend what must be defended because surrender would make life meaningless. That is the emotional truth of the last emperor. He did not stay because victory was likely. He stayed because leaving would have broken the final dignity of his office. There are moments when duty survives after hope has weakened. The final defense of Constantinople belongs to that kind of duty. For the Ottomans, the final assault belonged to another kind of historical energy, the conviction that a new order was ready to claim what the old order could no longer hold. Mehmed's men moved toward walls that had once seemed untouchable. They died in large numbers, but the army kept pressing. Behind them stood a state with momentum. In front of them stood a city with memory. Momentum and memory met in violence. Momentum won the city. Memory won the centuries, because we still speak of both. As we near the end of the story, we can imagine Constantinople not on the day it fell, but years later, when the first generation after conquest had begun to grow. A child walks through a city where Ottoman rule is normal. He sees minarets, markets, soldiers, ships, and old walls. Perhaps he hears older people speak of the emperor. Perhaps he knows Hagia Sophia only as a mosque. Perhaps he passes a Christian church where old prayers continue. Perhaps he plays near a ruin without understanding what it once was. For him, the city is not an ending. It is his world. This is how history heals and erases at the same time. The new generation lives because it does not fully feel the wound. The old generation mourns because it cannot stop feeling it. Between them, memory changes shape. Eventually, the last witnesses die. Then the fall belongs to story, ritual, text, monument, and imagination. The smell of smoke is gone. The exact voices are gone. The fear in the streets is gone. The physical hunger is gone. What remains is meaning. And meaning can last longer than experience. That is why we are still drawn to 1453, not because we can recover every detail. We cannot. Sources differ. Legends grow. Later accounts shape memory. Some details remain debated. But the core remains clear enough. A weakened city, a determined sultan, ancient walls, artillery, heroic defense, final assault, Ottoman victory, Byzantine extinction, and a transformed world. The story survives because its structure is unforgettable. Old city, young conqueror, last emperor, broken walls. Sacred transformation, new empire, long memory. It is history almost shaped like myth, yet rooted in real human suffering and real political change. That combination is rare and dangerous if handled poorly. If we make it only myth, we lose truth. If we make it only military analysis, we lose soul. The best telling holds both. The strategy and the sorrow, the cannon and the candles, the sultan and the mother, the emperor and the mason, the wall and the prayer. That is what gives the fall its lasting power. In the final reflection, Constantinople teaches that civilizations do not survive by beauty alone. They need resources, alliances, defense, unity, leadership, adaptation, and luck. The city had beauty. It had faith. It had history. It had courage. But by 1453, it lacked enough of the other things. Mehmed's empire had them in greater measure. That is why the walls fell. But the story also teaches that conquest does not fully erase what came before. The Ottomans took the city, but they inherited its layers. They transformed Hagia Sophia, but did not destroy its dome. They made the city their capital, but its Roman and Byzantine past continued to glow beneath Ottoman greatness. The conqueror becomes part of the conquered city's story, just as the conquered city becomes part of the conqueror's identity. No one owns a city's whole past, not even the victor. The past remains crowded. As night settles over the old city in our imagination, after all the centuries have passed, we can see the layers at once. The Roman foundations, the Byzantine walls, the Ottoman domes, the modern lights, the waters moving between continents, the hills carrying memory, the streets holding more footsteps than any history can count. Somewhere in that layered darkness, the last night of 1453 still exists. The defenders are at the wall. The Ottoman camp burns beyond the moat. The emperor is alive for a few more hours. The sultan is not yet inside the city. Hagia Sophia still holds its final Byzantine prayers. The walls are broken, but not yet crossed. The city is still itself. That is the haunting thing about last nights. They are ordinary until they are not. A person living through a last night may know danger is near, but cannot yet feel the full meaning of what is about to vanish. Only later do people look back and say, that was the last time. The last evening under the old order, the last prayer before conquest, the last watch on the wall, the last emperor among his people, the last dawn of Byzantium. But in the moment itself there is still breath, still waiting, still hope even if thin, still human beings doing what human beings do at the edge of history, standing, praying, fearing, repairing, listening, remembering, and trying to survive until morning. Morning came. The city fell. The empire ended. The city lived. And for centuries afterward, the world kept hearing the echo. And for centuries afterward, the world kept hearing the echo. It did not sound the same everywhere. In Ottoman memory, the echo was victory. It was the sound of a young sultan becoming the conqueror, of an army entering the city of emperors, of a prophecy fulfilled, of a new capital rising where an old empire had died. It was the sound of banners over ancient walls, of Hagia Sophia transformed, of the Bosporus held by a new power, of Ottoman ambition stepping confidently into world history. In Byzantine memory, the echo was grief. It was the sound of the last emperor disappearing into smoke, of the great church no longer belonging to the world that built it, of prayers spoken under a dome for a city that could not be saved, of families broken, of manuscripts carried away, of old names becoming memories, of Roman continuity finally losing its political body. In Western Europe, the echo was warning. It was the sound of Ottoman power now seated in Constantinople, of Christian disunity exposed, of crusading dreams failing to become action, of ancient walls broken by cannon, of a great city lost while kings and princes argued elsewhere. It was also, for some scholars, the sound of Greek learning moving westward, of manuscripts and teachers carrying pieces of the old world into new intellectual circles. In the city itself, the echo became daily life. That may be the strangest part of all. The event that later generations would treat as world-changing had to become ordinary for those who remained. People could not live forever inside the moment of conquest. They had to buy food, repair homes, find missing relatives, pay taxes, learn new rules, make peace with new neighbors, avoid danger. Teach children, continue prayers, learn when to speak and when to remain silent. The city's greatest transformation happened not only in palaces and mosques, but in kitchens, workshops, markets, alleys, courtyards, and family rooms. A mother who had seen the fall might one day watch her child run through a street under Ottoman rule. The child might laugh where she remembered terror. That is how time works. It allows life to continue, but continuation can feel cruel to those who remember. The city that had been wounded became home again to people who did not carry the wound in the same way. For the first generation, the fall was experience. For the second, it was family story. For the third, it was inherited memory. For later centuries, it became legend, identity, politics, scholarship, prayer, poetry, and argument. Each step away from the event changed it, but did not erase it. The last emperor remained central to this memory. Constantine XI had failed in every practical sense. He lost the city, the empire, and his life. Yet in memory, he gained a dignity no successful ruler could take from him. He became the emperor who stayed, the emperor who did not abandon the walls, the emperor who accepted the burden of ending. His death or disappearance allowed him to belong not only to history, but to myth. A body can be buried. A vanished emperor can be imagined forever. That is why traditions about him grew so powerfully. The idea that he might return, that he was not truly gone, that he slept somewhere beneath the earth or stone until a future restoration, speaks less about military reality than about emotional need. People who lose a world often create a hidden chamber in memory where that world still breathes. They cannot restore it outside, so they preserve it inside. Constantine XI became one of those hidden chambers. The city had fallen, but in legend, the emperor waited. This is not unusual. Human beings have always made sleeping kings, returning heroes, hidden saints, and lost cities. Such stories are not foolish in the way they are sometimes dismissed. They are ways of surviving political helplessness. If history has taken everything, imagination protects one final possibility. Maybe the story is not over. Maybe the king sleeps. Maybe the city will return. Maybe the world that ended has not ended completely. In practical history, Byzantium was gone. But in emotional history, it kept breathing through these images. The Ottomans, too, shaped the conquest into memory. Mehmed became Fatih, the conqueror, and his victory became a defining moment not only of his reign, but of Ottoman identity. The city made him larger than a successful warrior. It made him heir to a place of universal ambition. His court, laws, building projects, and imperial vision unfolded beneath the shadow of that conquest. To rule from Constantinople was to speak to the world differently than before. The Sultan did not merely take the city enlarged him. This is one of the strange powers of old capitals. They give their conquerors prestige, but also pressure. A ruler who sits in a city of emperors is always measured against ghosts. Mehmed could not be a small ruler after taking Constantinople. The city demanded grandeur. It demanded rebuilding. It demanded order. It demanded a future worthy of the past he had captured. In that sense, conquest was not the end of his challenge. It was the beginning of it. Over time, Ottoman Istanbul became one of the great cities of the world. It was not merely a trophy. It became alive with imperial administration, religious institutions, markets, schools, palaces, mosques, baths, charitable complexes, neighborhoods, shipyards, and trade. It became a city of many peoples, many languages, many faiths, many memories. The Ottoman achievement was real, deep, and lasting. And yet, beneath Ottoman greatness, the Byzantine layer remained, not as the ruling order, but as foundation, stone, memory, and inheritance. This layering is what makes the city almost impossible to simplify. It cannot be spoken of only as lost Constantinople, because Ottoman Istanbul was real and magnificent. It cannot be spoken of only as victorious Istanbul, because Byzantine Constantinople was real and magnificent too. The city is not faithful to one story. It holds many stories at once, even when those stories argue with one another. That is why it remains one of the great historical places on Earth. It is not clean. It is crowded with meaning. The fall of Constantinople also reminds us of the danger of believing that survival in the past guarantees survival in the future. The city had endured so many sieges that endurance became part of its identity. People had reason to believe in the walls. They had history behind them. But history can become a comfort that hides new conditions. The walls had held before, but the empire behind the walls was weaker now. The enemy outside was stronger now. The weapons were different now. The allies were uncertain now. The population was smaller now. The resources were thinner now. The old miracle was being asked to repeat itself with fewer human supports. Many societies make this mistake. They look at past survival and assume it proves future safety. They say, we have endured worse. They say our institutions are strong. They say our identity will protect us. They say our walls have never fallen, but the question is never only whether the walls are old and famous. The question is whether the whole living system behind them still has strength. Constantinople's walls were strong. The world behind them was exhausted. That is the sorrow, not that people did not fight. They did. Not that the city did not deserve memory. It does. Not that the walls were foolish. They were extraordinary. The sorrow is that the defenders were asked to solve with courage what centuries had made unsolvable. There is a lesson there, and it is not only medieval. Institutions, families, nations, careers, and lives can all reach moments where the final crisis is only the visible form of long neglect. The collapse appears sudden to those watching from afar. But inside, people may have felt the weakening for years. The fall happens in a day. The falling happens for generations. Constantinople teaches that difference. It also teaches that endings and beginnings are often the same event viewed from opposite sides. To Byzantium, 1453 was an ending. To the Ottoman Empire, it was a beginning. To the city, it was transformation. To later historians, it became a turning point. To ordinary people, it was survival. No single meaning cancels the others. This is important because history becomes dangerous when we allow only one emotion. If we allow only grief, we fail to understand Ottoman achievement. If we allow only triumph, we erase Byzantine suffering. If we allow only military analysis, we miss sacred meaning. If we allow only religious memory, we miss logistics, politics, and technology. If we allow only grand events, we lose the ordinary people who actually lived through them. The full story requires many lights. A candle in Hagia Sophia, a fire in the Ottoman camp, a torch at the wall, a lamp in a survivor's room. A scholar's dim study, a ship's lantern on the Bosporus. Each light shows something different. Together they reveal the city. By the time the final Byzantine generation faded, the fall had already begun turning into story. Those who had been children during the conquest became elders. They told what they remembered, or what they had been told, to people born after the world changed. The edges blurred. Facts mixed with grief. Names became symbolic. Places became charged. The last emperor became more than a ruler. Hagia Sophia became more than a building. The walls became more than walls. Memory does this because human beings cannot carry raw history forever. They shape it so it can be held. But shaped memory must be handled carefully. It can preserve dignity, but it can also simplify. It can comfort, but it can also harden into bitterness. It can inspire, but it can also hide inconvenient truths. The fall of Constantinople has been used in many ways across centuries: religious, nationalist, imperial, scholarly, romantic, political. Each use reveals something about the people using it. The city becomes a mirror again. But beneath every later use, the real event remains. A city under siege, defenders at the wall, Ottoman forces outside, cannon firing, prayers rising, a final assault, and the collapse of one imperial world into another. The human core should not be lost. Imagine the last night one final time. Not as a map, not as a textbook, as lived darkness. The air smells of smoke, dust, sweat, sea wind, and fear. The walls are damaged, patched, and watched. Men stand in places where stone has been broken and repaired too many times. Some are Greeks defending their own city. Some are Italians far from home. Some are exhausted laborers turned helpers in the defense. Some are priests. Some are nobles. Some are ordinary men drawn into extraordinary history. Beyond them, the Ottoman camp glows. Fires burn, soldiers prepare. Some men sharpen weapons, some pray, some think of reward, some think of death. Some are frightened but would never say it. Some believe they are about to witness destiny. Some will not survive the morning. Inside the city, people wait. Hagia Sophia holds final prayers. Other churches glow. Families whisper. The old, the young, the frightened, the faithful, the doubtful, all feel the pressure of time. No one knows exactly how the morning will move, but everyone feels that it may be the end of the city as they know it. The emperor is still alive. That fact matters. He is not yet legend. He is a man in a failing city, carrying a title older and heavier than his remaining power. He has choices, but none are easy. Escape might preserve his life but destroy his dignity. Surrender might save some lives but end the empire in humiliation. Resistance may lead to death, but it preserves meaning. He chooses the wall. Some choices do not change the outcome. They change the memory. Constantine XI could not save Constantinople, but he shaped how its fall would be remembered. Mehmed is also still outside the city. He is not yet the conqueror in the full sense. He is a young sultan at the edge of enormous success or enormous failure. If the assault fails, his authority may suffer. If it succeeds, he enters history forever. He has prepared, calculated, commanded, and risked. Now the final test approaches. He chooses attack. Some choices create the future. Between these two men stands the city. Old, wounded, sacred, hungry, afraid. The last heir of Rome, the future capital of the Ottomans, the place where the world is about to change hands. Then dawn begins its slow approach. It is tempting to imagine history holding its breath, but nature does not stop for human endings. The sky lightens because the earth turns. Birds may have moved. Water continued in the Bosporus. The morning came with indifference. That indifference makes the scene more painful. Human beings mark the day as catastrophic or glorious, but dawn itself belongs to no empire. The assault begins. The night fills with noise. Then the wall is crossed. Then the city falls. Then the old world ends. Then the new world begins, and still the sun rises. That is history's hardest mercy. It does not stop. For the dead, everything has ended. For the living, everything must continue. The fall of Constantinople is therefore not only about loss. It is about continuation after loss. It is about what survives when the political form dies. Buildings survive. Languages survive. Faith survives. Books survive. Memories survive. Some families survive. Some communities adapt. Some traditions move elsewhere. Some symbols become stronger because they are lost. Byzantium died as a state, but it continued as memory, art, theology, scholarship, and longing. The Ottoman Empire rose in the city, but it too would one day become memory. The city outlived them both. This is the final humility of Constantinople. No empire fully owns time. Not Rome, not Byzantium, not the Ottomans, not any power that came later. They all left marks, but the city became larger than their claims. It carried them, changed them, and outlasted them. The Bosporus kept moving. The hills remained. The stones endured. The names changed. The prayers changed. The rulers changed. The people changed. But the place remained one of the great crossroads of the human story. And maybe that is why the fall of Constantinople still draws us in. It is not merely because of cannons, walls, and emperors. It is because we sense, deep down, that every human world is a Constantinople of some kind. Every person, family, nation, or civilization builds walls around what it loves. Everyone trusts something to endure: a home, a tradition, a belief, a system, a name, a city, a memory. And everyone eventually faces forces it cannot fully control. The story asks quietly, what do we do when the walls begin to fail? Do we pretend the old strength remains? Do we call for help too late? Do we fight anyway? Do we preserve what can be carried? Do we adapt after the fall? Do we turn loss into memory? Do we let a new world grow from the ruins? Constantinople offers no simple answer. It offers many human answers. The emperor stays. The sultan attacks. The scholar carries books, the priest prays, the soldier climbs, the mother hides, the merchant returns. The city changes, the memory remains. As the final night of our journey settles, imagine standing on a hill outside the city long after the events have passed. The walls are still there, scarred and silent. The dome of Hagia Sophia rises in the distance. The water darkens under evening light. The modern city hums beyond the old stones, layered with centuries no single mind can hold. If you listen with imagination, you can still hear the old echoes. The cannon, the bells, the prayers, the drums, the shouted orders, the crack of stone. The silence after the emperor vanished. The first sounds of Ottoman rule, the low murmur of markets returning, the turning of pages in a scholar's hand, the whisper of stories told to children. The city is no longer the same city, and yet somehow it is. That is the mystery of historical places. They change completely and remain themselves. They lose empires and keep their shape. They bury grief and raise new buildings over it. They allow people to forget enough to live but preserve enough to remember. Constantinople fell in 1453, but the meaning of that fall never stopped unfolding. It unfolded in Ottoman glory, in Orthodox mourning, in European fear, in Renaissance learning, in military adaptation, in legends of the last emperor, in the layered identity of Istanbul. In every later historian who tried to decide whether this was an ending, a beginning, or both. And perhaps the truest answer is both. A world ended. A world began. The city remained. Under the moon, the old walls no longer need to defend an empire. They defend memory now. Not perfectly. Not completely. But enough. Enough for us to return in thought to that final night. Enough to remember that the people inside those walls were not symbols only, but breathing human beings. Enough to remember that the people outside them were not shadows only, but men carrying their own faith, fear, and ambition. Enough to remember that history is made when human lives meet forces larger than themselves. The last Roman dawn in the East has long passed. The Ottoman dawn that followed has also become history. But between them, in the smoke of 1453, we can still see the city standing for one final moment as both what it had been and what it was about to become. Constantinople, the city of walls, the city of domes, the city of emperors, the city of conquerors, the city that fell. The city that lived, the city that teaches us that nothing human lasts forever and yet nothing truly meaningful disappears completely. It changes form. It passes into stone, into water, into prayer, into books, into names, into stories, into the quiet place where memory waits after the noise of empire has faded. And there, beneath the long shadow of its walls, Constantinople still remains.